name is Shayla Favor, and I serve as the chair of Council's Criminal Justice Committee. Today, the Criminal Justice Committee is hosting this hearing in regards to the expansion of hate group affiliation background checks in alignment with Council's Reimagining Public Safety legislative agenda. I'd like to start by letting our viewing audience know that we do not have drafted legislation on this topic just yet. This was an intentional decision on my behalf because I wholeheartedly believe that this conversation and the idea of reimagining public safety should be both educational and collaborative for our residents and our legislators. With this hearing today, our goals are to define hate groups and what could be considered affiliation with such a group, review the current background check process for Columbus police officers, determine what actions are legally within the scope of City Council's authority, and finally, hear from Columbus residents who have an interest with this topic. Following today's hearing and working with the appropriate departments here at the city, we will draft legislation to be considered by the end of the month. We will share that information with the public once it has been drafted. Just a few weeks ago, I stated that there is no place for racism within law enforcement. That statement also extends to any type of discrimination or hatred determined by an individual's sex, sexual orientation, religion, or disabilities. The Southern Poverty Law defines a hate group as an organization that, based on its official statements or principles, the statements of its leaders, or its activities, has beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people, typically for their immutable characteristics. Any Columbus police recruit that has a history of affiliation with a hate group should be rooted out of the process before they are placed on our streets. Current police officers that have a current affiliation with these types of organizations should not be serving our residents. Recommendation number 37 from the Columbus Safety Advisory Commission recommends a required signed morality clause for all officers that would require them to agree to equal protection for all citizens, to denounce any cultural supremacist groups, and to report any officer's malfeasance to internal affairs. I also want to acknowledge Columbus resident Austin Owens, who submitted an ordinance on this topic, who we will hear from briefly a little later. Although it seems that this would be obvious problem, the First and 14th Amendments stands ready to protect every citizen's right to freedom of religion, expression, assembly, and right to petition, including public employees. Therefore, we must be carefully and intentionally do all that we can to ensure that affiliation with any hate group is not an issue here in Columbus. The flow for this evening will include a set of brief presentations, followed by questions, and finally, public testimony. I'd like to remind everyone that although this hearing is virtual, all of our guests will not be available the entire length of the hearing, and I want to thank them in advance for participating with us today. We are all here to listen and learn, and I look forward to an informational session tonight. I want to begin our presentations on the topic at hand with some background on the history of hate groups. We are joined this evening by Dr. Judson L. Jeffries. Dr. Jeffries is a professor of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. He earned his doctorate at the University of Southern California in 1997. Prior to arriving at OSU in 2006, he was an associate professor of political science with appointments in Homeland Security Studies and American Studies. Dr. Jeffries is the author of 8 books and many journal articles. He is a Phi Beta Kappa and a proud member of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. Dr. Jeffries, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone, and I apologize for the glitch in video. I am on a Ohio State University computer, and there are certain protocols and permissions that one has to obtain in order to download certain things. So I apologize for that, but I hope that my audio is coming through crystal clear. Good evening.
Good evening, sir. We can hear you.
Before I embark on the discussion of hate groups, I think it's important that I first place the discourse in its proper context so as to allow the good folk of Franklin County to fully grasp and appreciate what you all are trying to do here today. In fact, I liken your effort to that of the work of the great Ida B. Wells Barnett and many others who a century ago tried as they might to get an anti-lynching bill passed, but were unsuccessful. In fact, to this day, we have still been unable to get an anti-lynching bill passed. I trust, though, that you folk will be more successful in your effort here this evening, and I wanted to take that opportunity to applaud you. This is a monumental undertaking and much needed. So having said that, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are approximately, thereabouts, 1,000 to 1,100 hate groups in the United States of America. I caution folk, though, to take that number with a grain of salt. Instead, how I would couch this, where I'm working for the Southern Poverty Law Center, is that there are approximately 1,000 to 1,100 hate groups in the United States of America that we have been able to identify. History has shown that some groups operate in a clandestine manner, so we would be naive to believe that the 1,000 to 1,100 hate groups, that number is accurate. I don't believe it to be so. In Ohio, there's supposedly anywhere between 40 and 50, and again, I would employ that same grain of salt. So historically, when we think of hate groups, the one that normally comes to mind is the KKK. And in fact, throughout my brief discussion, one of the things that you'll notice is that I'm going to spend some time debunking some myths and unraveling some misunderstandings about hate groups. So the KKK is the most well-known hate group historically in North America. And contrary to popular belief, it wasn't founded in the state of Mississippi or Georgia, or as some folk have thought, Indiana, but rather was founded in Tennessee in a little small town called Pulaski, which at the time had no more than maybe 1,500 people. And it was no accident that the KKK was founded on the heels of the Civil War and at the start of the Reconstruction. Reconstruction going from 1865 to 1877. KKK being founded by several veterans of the Confederate Army. And then, of course, also in the South, you had a group called the White Citizens Council that was founded many years later in 1953. That organization was indeed founded in Mississippi, more specifically in Sunflower County, Mississippi, and again in 1953. That the organization was founded in that year also was not a surprise, not coincidental. For, as you know, the landmark case Brown versus Board of Topeka, Kansas, came down in 1954 in anticipation of this ruling. Several whites in the county got together and formed this organization. Several of them elected officials, politicians, and people of wealth. Now, the reason why I'm going over all of this is because there are some who are of the opinion that hate groups are comprised only or mainly of whites of a certain socioeconomic status, meaning low income, undereducated, poor whites. Well, I'm here to tell those who are under that impression that that has never been the case, and it still isn't. It may very well be now the case that the majority of the rank and file consist of that demographic, but the folks who are setting the agendas and making decisions are oftentimes not poor or undereducated. In short, these groups comprise of whites of all walks of life. So now, one of the things that should concern us about hate groups is not so much the size of a hate group itself, because a hate group, like many other groups, attract people for various reasons. A chance to be somebody in that person's eyes, a sense of belonging, the idea that there are strength in numbers, and in many cases, a shared ideology amongst its members. While that is disconcerting, one of the things that we should be most alarmed about is, again, not the numbers of these hate groups or the number of members, but the number of supporters that these hate groups garner. What do I mean by that? So, in my humble opinion, you have basically two kinds of supporters. You have covert supporters of these hate groups across North America, and you have overt supporters. Now, allow me a minute to explain. So, covert supporters are those who participate in a demonstration or join a rally. And even those who are open to signing a petition, which obviously involves writing their John Hancock down for posterity. Those are covert supporters. Even those who are willing to support a hate group financially in the form of writing a check. Then you have overt. Those are overt supporters. Then you have covert supporters who operate in a stealth manner, right? So a covert supporter is someone who sympathizes with the cause. That person may be someone who will loan members of the hate group space in order to hold meetings. Covert supporter might also slip members of the group a few dollars in cash so as to let you know that their allegiance is with you, but at the same time, careful not to leave a paper trail by writing a check or the transmission of money electronically. Won't do that. These covert supporters might also meet with you behind closed doors, but will take special care never to be seen with you in public. So while I can understand people being put off with the number of hate groups, and indeed some folk believe that there is a proliferation of hate groups, I'm not sure that I subscribe to that idea. I think that rather there being a proliferation of hate groups, that we are seeing in ways that we had not seen in the past, hate groups being more public with their persona and their activities because they feel emboldened by people who occupy certain spheres of influence and power. So they feel emboldened to come out publicly. So what we should really be putting our heads together and trying to mitigate throughout the efforts of those I consider covert supporters and overt supporters, neither of whom may be actually card-carrying members of a hate group. A hate group may consist of 100 people, but the supporters could be 1,500. That's dangerous. So if you all remember, and I'll close in a few minutes, if you all remember, one of the more public spectacles that involved members of hate groups took place in Virginia a few years ago. There was a certain amount of irony there in that, contrary to popular belief, Mississippi was never the capital of the cradle of Confederacy, but that moniker belonged to the state of Virginia, mainly because after the landmark ruling of Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, 1954, it took quite a while in order for states to go about the business of desegregating its schools with all deliberate speed, as Earl J. Warren, Chief Justice at that time, ordered. What happened was that a number of states, rather than desegregating its public schools, either closed them or converted them to private schools to prevent Black folk from attending. The state of Virginia was the last holdout state. What I mean by that is when the states started following the edict handed down by Supreme Court, Virginia was the last to comply. So much so that many scholars and writers took to writing books titled Massive Resistance, in which Virginia was featured prominently. Well, as you know, one of the most prestigious colleges and universities in the United States of America, and indeed the South, is Mr. Jefferson's University, also known as the University of Virginia, which is located in Charlottesville, about 45 minutes from a county called Culpeper County. And indeed, when we think about the most prestigious schools in the South, UVA would easily rank up there with Duke, Vanderbilt, and William and Mary. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because as the nation saw, a number of folk, we would be led to believe, descended on the city of Charlottesville as members of hate groups. So it was believed that these men and women, though largely men, who were engaging in this kind of racial turmoil were out-of-towners. Talking to folk that I know who teach at the University of Virginia and who've lived in Charlottesville for years, I know that to be a falsehood. A number of the folk who participated in that racial vitriol were not only residents of Charlottesville, but natives of Charlottesville. And it's ironic for a number of reasons. It's for nothing else because the university again was founded by Thomas Jefferson, and as you know, in the Declaration of Independence, he talked about inalienable rights, and he talked about Americans being able to bask in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Well, what we witnessed in Charlottesville over the course of several days was an anathema to that. So I'm going to close by saying while the numbers of hate groups in the United States of America is indeed somewhat alarming, we need to spend some time thinking about what we can do to thwart the efforts of those who are not members but sympathize with these hate groups in the form of being covert and overt supporters. It is my humble opinion that along with just flat out wholesale racism, poverty, substandard health care, and inadequate education, that hate groups in the United States of America represents one of the gravest threats to the internal security of our country in the 21st century. And I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffries. I really appreciate you just level setting us on the subject matter at hand. I think it's truly important for my colleagues and our residents to have some background on hate groups in America and where they currently stand. I know as a professor, you could go on and on about this subject matter, and it's so much to cover, quite honestly. In such a short amount of time. But let me allow my colleagues to answer some questions because I know that you do have a hard stop this evening and I want to respect your time. So Pro Tem Brown, do you have any questions for Dr. Jeffrey?
Thank you so much, Councilmember Favor, and thank you, Dr. Jeffries, for spending your time this evening educating us. My question, first and foremost, to underscore your point that you ended with, which is the threat to domestic security that these groups represent. And this is terrorism. They are domestic terrorist organizations, and the council taking the time to consider their effect on our city is critically important. So I want to thank you, Councilmember Favor, for championing this. And given that racism and hate have no place in law enforcement, as you said, Council Member Dr. Jeffries, I would ask you, do you have any recommendations for policymakers? Because not everyone who affiliates with a hate group, as you said, is an overt affiliator. So what other signs are typical? Are there other ways that people demonstrate allegiance? You mentioned some of the ways in which they support, but are there things that we can look out for as policymakers in developing a real policy for checking for affiliation?
Okay, thanks for the question. You were breaking up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. And your question is a very learned one. And one of the reasons why it is, and then I'll answer your question directly, one of the reasons why it is because so historically there were some police departments, namely Chicago PD and LAPD, who for years would place billboards and place ads in Southern newspapers urging white males to move to Chicago and move to Los Angeles to join the police department. And the reason why they were recruiting in these regions is because they were looking for a certain mindset. This was especially true during the 1960s, when the country was racked by these uprisings, before and after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. It was thought that new measures had to be put in place in order to corral these people of color, and calls went out in various places in the South to recruit a certain mindset in its officer. I say all of that to say that somehow, and you all already know this, but I think it bears reiterating, somehow we have to do a better job of screening applicants. So, and when I say screening, I mean leaving the screening up to people whose life's work involves identifying and detecting things in people's backgrounds that would raise a red flag. So, for instance, if you want to become an officer in the United States military, you're going to fill out an application that is darn near as thick as a small town telephone book, and the background check is going to go as far back as your elementary school and junior high school teachers. That's a long, staggered process. I think something like that needs to be had when it comes to folk who want to wear the badge and the gun. The morality clause, I think that is a terrific idea. Along with the morality clause, though, there has to be clear, concise directives that indicate what an individual will suffer in the event the morality clause is infringed upon, right? So if an officer or an applicant is made to sign a morality clause, all right, in the event it is breached, there has to be some punitive measure so as to deter other officers from going astray. Now, I don't know how much you all have kept up with these webinars at Ohio State and other places, but I've been saying for years that, hey, listen, just like we have a 3 strikes and you're out law, just as we have laws that says, hey, listen, if you get caught with powder cocaine versus crack cocaine, there are mandatory sentences waiting for you, right? And what I've been saying to folks is, hey, listen, no one is castigating all police officers. The overwhelming majority of police officers do a fine job. They became police officers because they were looking for a job that offered some advancement. They were looking for a job that allowed them to support their family. They were looking for a job that enabled them to do, to make a difference in their communities, right? But there's a small segment of police forces around the country who are rogue and who abuse their power and who harbor bigoted sentiments about people of color, namely people of African descent. And there's no way around that, no matter how much someone like Sheriff Clark from Milwaukee would have us to believe, right? So at the end of the day, I've been saying we have to do a better job of screening. We need to increase the qualifications for those wanting to serve and protect. What I mean by that, a college education, and I mean a 4-year college education. You don't have to do that. But I would argue that one needs more than a high school diploma in order to take on this monumental task of serving and protecting the American people. So a 2-year degree would suffice, depending on the kind of education that person gets. So I argue an education that's steeped in the human condition, the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, things of that nature. And then, of course, the hiring of more women, because even though there have been cases of women being guilty of extra-legal force against folk that has resulted in their demise, that happens significantly less than incidents that involve pedestrians and motorists and male police officers. Women police officers are far less likely to engage in that kind of chicanery. But at the end of the day, we need a better screening process by those who do this for a living, and we need penalties in place that says, hey, listen, if you are found guilty of this, there's a certain prison sentence waiting for you, as opposed to the few officers who engage in this kind of chicanery. What happens is they get fired. They don't get charged. They don't get convicted. They certainly don't get sentenced. They get fired. The city ends up paying huge settlements to either the victim, if the victim lives, or the victim's families. But the officer gets transferred to another police department. And by the time that person retires, that person has a jacket that's about as thick as a small town's telephone book, right? And that's an abomination. So if we could crack down on these folk who continue to get these complaints and get these folks off the force, one, and for those who are guilty, charge them, convict them, and sentence them to jail. I think we can make some headway, but until we start doing that, it's going to be business as usual.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffries and Councilmember Brown. Councilmember Dorrance.
Thank you, Chair Favor. Dr. Jeffries, I really appreciate sort of the historical context that you've sort of set here. I wanted to ask a bit of a follow-up from President Pro Tem Brown's question that you talked about. I think when you look at the example you talked about, that recruiting, decades ago, specifically in the South for officers, in retrospect, we know exactly what that was intended to do. Folks at the time likely knew as well, but they probably hid their intentions to some degree. I was curious if within your experience and your research, whether there are other practices going on today that sort of strikes you in a similar manner, that there's been an intentional recruiting done within sort of the law enforcement community that, if we were to look back, 10 years later, say, hey, that wasn't the best way to do it from a sense of targeting the wrong applicant pool. I was wondering if you could speak to that for a moment, if you've run into sort of recruiting procedures somewhere across the country that reminds you of some of those efforts in the past that maybe directly smacked of racism.
No, not necessarily. That's a great question. No, not necessarily. I wish I could say I have. No, not necessarily. So full disclosure. So I was born and raised in a military law enforcement family. So someone was either a cop or was in the military or had done both. So I have a great deal of respect for law enforcement. So I want to make that perfectly clear. But to answer your question, no, not necessarily. Here is something, though. Here is something that a police chief tried and was basically run out of town. And this relates to not only your question, but the previous one. And it has to do with, again, an applicant having the kind of education that you would want a person to possess if they're going to be dealing with any number of complex problems on the street. We have to acknowledge that police officers have probably the most difficult and challenging job of any street-level bureaucrat in the United States of America. Not everyone is equipped to handle the complexities that come with that occupation. Chief Penny Harrington, I've mentioned her name before, an esteemed police officer. She was, at the time, one of the first Caucasian lady, one of the first female police chiefs of a major metropolitan police force in the country. She was at one time police chief in the city of Portland, although the city of Portland don't use the words police chief per se. Well, she had the bright idea, which I thought was a good one. She had the bright idea to, obviously, increase the education standards for those who wanted to join the Portland Police Department. So she said, okay, well, college education. And you would have thought that she killed someone. The reaction that she got from the rank and file was swift and immediate. Suffice to say, she didn't last long as police chief of that city. So I say all that to say there have been efforts to bring in police departments a recruit with a higher level of education and a recruit that exemplifies a higher level of moral fiber by any number of police officials across the country. Oftentimes their efforts have been thwarted, but I cannot think of, your question is a great one, but I cannot think of efforts to recruit officers that mirror those to which I referred earlier, except that, hey, listen, I don't think necessarily that it's a good idea to target men and women coming out of the military, which I do, which I have seen happening, requires an entirely different skill set. Police officers are expected to get to know the community, to intermingle, to interface with the community. Although over the years that has become less and less true because, as you know, police officers typically patrol communities behind the windshield of a car, right? So when I was growing up in New York City in the 70s, it was not uncommon to see police officers actually walking a beat whose name you knew, and he knew your name and your parents and things of that nature. Well, that's gone the way of the dinosaur, and police departments have become increasingly militarized. You can thank the LAPD for that, namely Daryl Gates, who was the inventor of SWAT back in the mid-1960s. And as a result of it becoming militarized, it has welcomed with open arms those who have served in our armed forces. I'm not sure that that's a good recipe because those positions require different skill sets.
Thank you, Councilmember Dorrance. Dr. Jeffries, do you have a few more minutes?
Well, you'll be happy to know that I made dinner for my family early.
Oh.
So I have at least 20 minutes remaining.
Okay, great. I'm going to just, as a point of privilege, our resident Austin Owens, he is one of the reasons why we are all gathered tonight to talk about this very important matter. He also has a previous engagement that he has to get to. And so if you don't mind, Dr. Jeffries, I want to provide an opportunity for Mr. Owens to hop on and to really give us some of the background and his motivation for sending his thoughts, his ideas to City Council. Austin, are you still with us?
Yes, ma'am.
The floor is yours, sir.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Favors. And I'm making a note here to audit Dr. Jeffries' class so I can learn everything because this man is a font of knowledge and I would love to learn from him. So thank you for that, Dr. Jeffries. I guess, first I want to state that I'm acting as a citizen. I am a teacher at Columbus City Schools, and my views may or may not represent those of Columbus City School District. So be that as it may. One of the reasons why I wanted to send this in is because I went to a rally downtown, and there was a lot of energy, a lot of chanting, a lot of want for some action, but I couldn't discern any actionable moves. There was no one saying, let's do this. It was a lot of Black Lives Matter. So I come home and I think to myself, what can I do to give something that is both actionable and easy to implement? So I look at the root source of how police are hired. And I want to state that I am not anti-police. I am not anti-free speech. Hate itself is not a crime, as the FBI and the Southern Poverty Law Center will state. But I think that our police officers, and I hope they will agree, they should be held to a higher standard. So I look at the hiring standards for the police department, and I'm shocked to see that there's nothing stating in there that you can't be a member of a hate group. And so I run downstairs and I tell my wife, and she tells me to go away. And then, so I look into it, and I do a little bit of research, and I see that maybe this is something that we can do as a city. Maybe not nationally, maybe not statewide, but as a city, Columbus is one of the best places to live in the world. Let's see what we can do. So I sat down, did some research on how to write a resolution and ordinance, had some help from friends. We bounced it off each other, and I was lucky to submit it. So I would like to live in a city where citizens know that their safety is not contingent on the color of their skin, sexual orientation, or any other immutable characteristics. If I get pulled over for speeding, I should be viewed as a speeder and not a African-American speeder, or whatever the case may be. So my goal in this was to give an opportunity for us to have some legislature or some measure of pause when when people are applying to be police officers, to eliminate hate from the group.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. And let me personally just say thank you for really taking the time to engage in the legislative process. We understand, and I have said that the moment of protest, although not completely gone, it will stop at some point to some degree. And it's what happens after that that truly matters. And so your engagement demonstrates that you have a council that is listening with all ears at this moment, and we're engaging at all levels. And we're serious about this work. So thank you for taking the first step. Do any of my colleagues have any questions or comments for Mr. Owens? Well, Mr. Owens, I know you have to get out of here. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and look forward to continuing to work with you for the month of July, and once we finally pass legislation at the end of the month.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Jeffries, you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think we left off with Councilmember Dorrance. And before we moved on, Councilmember Dorrance, did you have any additional questions?
I did not. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jeffries. I appreciate it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Councilmember Remy.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Favor, and certainly appreciate Mr. Owens bringing this forth to us to discuss and belabor today. Dr. Jeffries, it's been fascinating watching or listening to you as you talk about kind of the historical perspective. I've taken the opportunity to watch again 13th, just watched that this morning, and certainly read the book Rise of the Warrior Cop.
Yes.
Which is interesting about the historical perspective of the police department and the militarization of the police department. What are, a little bit beyond the scope of hate groups, what are some of the other things that can really make, I've been very interested in making our police force reflect more of our community. And we, the city of Columbus, have struggled a little bit to achieve some of those goals. And so, I'd be interested in your perspective, whether it, be things like uniforms that they wear, to, our department has kind of a diversity to allowing like beards, for instance, and tattoos and the look of the uniform, and do those things matter? Do they should they be a consideration as we look to make a friendlier police force that really reflects the community that they serve?
Okay, so one of the things that I have been arguing about for years, I remember talking to former city attorney Rick Pfeiffer about this maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, and his response to me was, "Yeah, I like your idea, but I'm not sure that the police union will go for it." So at the end of the day, we simply have to hire a person with a higher caliber of character. That's all there is to it. We have to hire a person employ a person with a higher caliber of character. And one of the things I've been advocating for the past several years is, hey, so now, one of the things we could do is make the police law enforcement occupation more attractive, or attractive to folk who typically would not go that route, right? So now, two things I've been talking about for years. One, increase the pay. It's a hazardous job, although a lot of police work involves pushing paper and simply driving around in a squad car. We know that, but it's still hazardous work. And it's stressful work because police officers, when they are called to the scene, they often see the worst in the human condition, right? No one calls a police officer to invite them to a birthday party, unless, of course, they're a family member or a close friend or something. When police officers are called, it's because someone needs help. There's a situation that's gotten out of hand. There's nothing positive going on, right? So two things. One, increase the pay, and two, more importantly, come up with formulate a program that's similar to officer candidate school at the United States military level, right? So there are any number of folk historically who would have in no way, shape, or form considered the military as an option were it not for the officer candidate program. What I mean by that is you say, okay, well, either during college you're going to do ROTC, or after college you're going to go to officer candidate school. You're going to get your commission as a second lieutenant. So come up with a program whereby something similar to that allows you to come in as a police officer at a higher rank because of your credentials, and because you are coming in at a higher rank because of your credentials, you also come in at a higher salary, right? I think if we are able to come up with that sort of arrangement, you will see a different kind of person joining police departments all across the nation. And you will see a different kind of policing taking place in communities everywhere. Moreover, I think with that, you will see the fracturing of this thing called the thin blue line, right? Because there will be a segment of the police force that will be professionalized, highly educated and professionalized, who will hold those who engage in this kind of criminality to a higher standard. I don't think they would last very long. So if we just figure out a way to hire higher caliber character people, I think we can mitigate some of these issues that we've been seeing since time immemorial. And I don't want anyone to tell me, well, Dr. Jeffries, what police officers need is better training. No, I don't want to hear that foolishness. It has nothing to do with training. Police officers get good training. Some police officers ignore that training when it comes to people who don't look like them. And I don't want to hear this foolishness about, okay, well, police departments need to hire more African-American officers. Well, yeah, that's too simplistic. The people who argue that, what they don't realize is that sometimes when you increase the numbers of African-American officers, that is similar to the election of a black mayor in a city that hadn't had a black mayor. What do I mean by that? Follow the logic. So sometimes cities that have never had a black mayor, that particular party, whether it's Democrat or Republican, but we can scratch that. So it's almost always Democrat. The Democratic Party catches lightning in a bottle and is able to elect an African American to the mayor's office. Well, sometimes there is a high level of resentment amongst people in the general public, especially police officers, because we all know that police officers in cities work under the supervision of the mayor, just like the governor oversees the National Guard and the commander-in-chief of the United States military is the president. And this resentment on the part of police officers manifests itself in the way they deal with black people on the streets and on the highways, right? So the officer says, okay, well, I can't do anything about the fact that you all have elected a black man as mayor. But what I can do is take my frustrations out on those that I see on the street and those that I stop along the highway who are black. So sometimes the increase, especially if the increase is the kind of increase that is visibly substantial, that you have, I'm just going to make this up, you have a police force that's like 8% black, and then all of a sudden you have a police force that's like 15 to 20% black. You see that kind of increase, that breeds resentment among some officers. And what happens is you have an increase in incidents of excessive force against people of color. So we have to think beyond these little simplistic, age-old solutions to problems that require a bit more sophistication in our thinking. We simply have to find a way to recruit a better caliber of officer, whether that person be black, white, or what have you. And those who step over the line, who commit murder, like Officer Chauvin, they have to be charged, convicted, and sit in this jail for a long time. You know, before you all get tired of hearing my soapbox musings, I just want to mention this. When Officer Chauvin nailed on Mr. Floyd's neck, what he was doing symbolically was thumbing his nose up at everyone who nailed over the past couple of years during the playing of the national anthem. He was thumbing his nose up at everyone who supported Colin Kaepernick, basically saying, okay, you want to kneel? I'll show you what kneeling looks like. Try this on for size, right? And the most disturbing thing about it is that he knew he was being filmed. He never tried to camouflage. He never tried to obstruct the view of the phone camera. He knelt for nearly 9 minutes in a cavalier manner with his hands in his pocket, at times looking directly into the camera, thumbing his nose up at those who support Colin Kaepernick, those who, in his mind, disrespect the flag, and those who believe there's merit in supporting Black Lives Matter. And he did that because history told him that historically he would be protected, that he could carry out this murder in broad daylight and do so with impunity. Now, had he realized that he would end up being the poster child for all that is wrong with police departments across the United States of America, I'm sure he would have thought twice. But in his mind, in his psychopathic mind, at that moment, I believe he thought to himself, I'm going to be protected by the state. I'm not worried about one blessed thing. While at the same time, rubbing it in the faces of those who believe that police officers should be held to a high standard, that despite the lack of clear-cut data that shows that people of color, namely Black people, are policed harsher than whites, despite that clear-cut scientific data, we all know that to be the case. He was saying, hey, to hell with all of you all. Look at me. Watch this. I'll give you something to kneel about. And that was moving. That was moving in a negative way. And I said to my wife, now, if this doesn't prompt change, I don't know what will. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffries. Councilmember Tyson?
And if my camera goes out, I'm sorry. But Dr. Jeffries, thank you for being here. And again, I want to thank Mr. Austin also. But earlier in your presentation, you stated there are about 40 to 50 hate groups in the state of Ohio. And so, supposedly. And so, since we know that we certainly recruit from not only from Columbus, but our contiguous counties, how would we identify those supposed hate groups within the state of Ohio? I think that would be important for us to even have an understanding of that. Especially, like I said, we can recruit from contiguous counties and just want to have an understanding of if there are hate groups that we know of in those areas in which we know we recruit.
Councilwoman, you were breaking up pretty bad. Could you repeat your question, please?
I'm sorry, can you? Okay. My question, let me turn this off. So my question is, you mentioned earlier that there are about 40 to 50 hate groups in Ohio. And as I mentioned, we recruit in the contiguous counties of Columbus. And just wondering if there are, if you know if there are hate groups within any of those contiguous counties.
Oh, I got you. Well, the answer is yes. And the reason why the answer is yes is because the thing about hate groups, go back to my comment about overt and covert supporters. So yeah. you may not have a, I'm just going to make this up. I'm going to use this language. You may not have a chapter of the Aryan Brothers, for instance. You may not have a chapter of the Aryan Brothers in Lima, right? But you have supporters of the Aryan Brothers in Lima, and they meet on an ad hoc basis. So when you say, are there hate groups in the contiguous areas in which police departments recruit, I'd have to say yes. I'd be naive if I said no, because just because the card-carrying members of an official group doesn't show up on the radar doesn't mean that their supporters don't exist and meet in those particular areas. So yeah, I would say yes. Absolutely, I would say yes. But again, the kind of screening that I'm talking about needs to be done by folk who do this for a living. I know for a fact that the FBI has a pretty rigorous screening process when it comes to ferreting out members of hate groups. What exactly they do, I don't know. But it would take an agency like that to be involved in the hiring of a law enforcement officer in order to weed out the kind of folk that we know would be problematic. If you're a sympathizer, you're problematic. If you're an overt supporter, you're problematic. which
All right.
would automatically eliminate you from contention.
That's absolutely correct. So thank you. And I think that I see Ms. DeLong, Director DeLong's on the call. And so I'm sure I see her shaking her head. And I know that we do have a process, but I'm sure that a process can always be improved. And certainly we do want to identify anyone that would be overt or covert that are sympathizers or involved in these racial groups, these hate groups, so that we can make sure that our residents are being treated in an equitable way in every aspect of their lives. So thank you for sharing today.
Councilwoman Tyson, as you know, my last point, as you know, hey, listen, when you are screened to sit on the jury, one of the questions is hey, listen, do you have is there a member of your family that is in any way connected to this case? And if the answer is yes, you're a prime candidate for dismissal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, Jeffrey, but I just saw something on TV. Not only are you dismissed for that, but you're dismissed for, what you wear to court. I mean, there's so many. I just watching a show just 2 days ago, just all the ways that they remove Black and brown people from that jury pool. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Unfortunately, folks, I'm going to have to leave. Is there anything else?
I just want to give one moment to our council president to ask you any questions or comments.
Okay.
I don't have any questions, so it works. Dr. Jeffries, to say thank you. The only funny thing that I would say is that in your presentation, you mentioned a list of extraordinary Southern colleges and universities, but you omitted one of the most important, which is Morehouse College, my alma mater. But
Here we go.
I'll just leave it there.
Well, President Harden, you are exactly right. And I'll have you know that in the late 90s, I taught in the Department of Political Science at Morehouse College.
Thank God I got out before, or I might not be sitting here today.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffries, for your time. We truly appreciate your insight. Have a wonderful evening.
All right, thank you. Good luck, folks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Next, I'd like to go ahead and kick this over to Director Amy DeLong. She serves as the Executive Director of our Civil Service Commission. Director DeLong, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Councilmember Favor. Thanks for inviting me to speak with all of you this evening. I think Councilmember Tyson kind of was leading into this, so I think it's great that I'm next in the process. So as you guys are all aware, the process for the police officer selection is a multiple phase process. So let me kind of take you through it in like 30 seconds or less. After a person applies for police officer, they test, they go through a background process, then they also go through a medical and psychological exam. The test is a three-part process here at Civil Service. The first is the multiple choice in writing. The second is COPE, which stands for Columbus Oral Police Exam. And the last is the physical fitness exam. Once they've completed that test and passed all three parts, they're put on the eligible list. That eligible list then is used by safety when they're ready to begin their hiring. But as a part of their hiring process, they go through a background standard where they review the candidates. I'm not going to get into those details because I know Mr. Stone and Mr. Blunt is on tonight and are going to go through those details. But I do want to say that as a part of that process, they go through the personal history questionnaires that all the candidates apply complete against our background standards. But that's not the final review of those background standards. The Civil Service Commission ensures that those standards, as they're applied by them, are applied fairly and consistently among all of the candidates by reviewing all of the candidates' applicant files again against the background standards. In addition, Civil Service Commission is responsible for the medical and the psychological contracts. We bid those out every 3 years. We contract with health professionals. And today we have the Association for Psychotherapy's owner, Dr. Amy Spees, and she's going to address the process that candidates go through to determine if they're a good fit psychologically and emotionally for the position of police officer. And she's on the line, and I'm turning it over to her right now.
Hello, Director DeLong. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and for the committee, thank you for allowing me. I'm Dr. Spees, and this is my colleague and teaching partner, Dr. Webb. Dr. Webb actually does a lot of the testing for API. What I would like to say before I turn it over to her actually is that we are committed to helping the city and actually a lot of Ohio find the best officer candidates. And we try to stay on top of the research and what is going on in the world of policing, and in order to help us do that. So we are fortunate enough to have access to the recruits. Also, once they are hired for teaching, and we do have them for about 30 hours, and we can talk about that after this. But I would like to turn it over to Dr. Webb so she can explain the process that they go through, and she's kind of my testing guru. So, put my mask on.
Okay. Thank you. As Dr. Spees introduced me, I'm Dr. Jennifer Berger, and I do the psychological screening process for multiple departments, the Columbus Police Department being one of those. Our portion of the process, as Director DeLong mentioned, it occurs after a conditional offer of employment has been extended to the applicants. That allows us to conduct a very thorough investigation into personal aspects of their lives. So when our process starts, we explain thoroughly to the candidate what's going to happen. We verify their ID, and they sign consent and waiver forms in order for us to communicate the information back to the department. They complete a biographical form, which gives us some basic information, and they are administered 2 psychological tests. Those tests are then scored. And we review those scored exams, and then we have access to the background investigation and the polygraph results that occur before our step of the process. We review those, and then we start our psychological interview. This psychological interview does touch on many areas that are discussed with the candidate during the background investigation. However, while the background investigator is looking at the history of the candidate, we are looking to see if that history and pattern of behavior means that they are likely to use either positive or negative behaviors in their future employment. Okay, so in covering, I'm going to talk just about some of those areas that we go into the interview, so you can see what it is that we're zeroing in on that affects us picking up on any hate group affiliation, if there is any. Okay, so we start with early developmental and psychosocial history. We discuss with them what their families of origin are like, what is the background of that particular family culture and how they were raised. We go through their education, elementary, middle school, high school. We're looking at achievement. We're looking at behaviors in and out of that school environment, and then beyond after graduation. We look into their legal history and their driving record, any military history if there is any, and then we move into substance use, either alcohol or illicit drug use, and move into their relationship history. Within this relationship history, we're looking for stability. We're looking if there's any legal involvement, either for domestic violence concerns or child abuse and neglect. And then we are also looking into their social relationships. How do they describe their social groups? What do they do in their free time? That gives us a more complete picture of who they are as a person. Because as we know with law enforcement, their personal life affects their work and their work affects their personal life. So we need to see some consistency in behavior patterns. If they do have work history within law enforcement, we look into any use of force they may have had, any critical incidents they may have been involved in, and any psychological debriefing that may have occurred. Any complaints from the public that have been made against that officer, and any internal affairs investigations that may have occurred. We also look into their psychological history, whether they've had previous pre-employment psychological evaluations, and whether they've been involved in psychological treatment in the past. Now, psychological treatment is not necessarily a negative experience. So we are looking for individuals that take action in their lives to better themselves and to be of their best health emotionally and physically. So we may have an applicant who has a history of mild generalized anxiety, has sought treatment, they're no longer symptomatic. They may have experienced something traumatic early in their childhood or early in their adult life, and yet they've sought treatment and are functioning very well. That actually speaks very well to their resilience. And that's one of the attributes that we're looking for that would demonstrate a strong candidate. We do dig into any biases they may have. We're looking for biases based on gender, race, disability, nationality. As you know, we have a very diverse population here. Any biases based on religion or sexual orientation, and also socioeconomic status. We then look into any tendency towards addictive behavior with gambling, inappropriate sexual behavior. That tells us a lot about their judgment. And then we also look into tattoos. That opens up an interesting discussion as to the meaning behind them and allows us to assess if there's any sexual nature, any violence displayed, any gang-related symbols, any antisocial themes within those tattoos. Obviously, in and of themselves, that's not a problem. It's what they represent that we are looking for, because people often express themselves through their body art. So we're looking to see if patterns of concern and hate group affiliation or biases infiltrate any of those aspects of their life. In general, we're looking for global open-mindedness in our candidates. It's not just looking to make sure that they aren't something, but it's also looking to make sure that they have characteristics that we know build a resilient officer. So we're looking for things such as empathy. Have they been able to demonstrate that in their personal or professional life? Can they demonstrate that with me in the office during the interview? Are they flexible in their thinking? We know individuals with rigidity in their thinking are more likely to be very black and white and not able to make decisions relevant to a situation in a fast-moving moment. And we're also looking for tolerance and for self-monitoring. So what we know in the psychological world is that the ability to recognize a weakness is really important in promoting change. And so we're looking for those applicants to have cognitive functioning at the level where they can recognize if they do have a weakness, they're able to self-monitor, and that they've demonstrated motivation to improve any weaknesses they may have. I just want to touch on a couple other areas that we pick up on in the psychological assessment, the testing side of it. Some of our scales will give us information for things like I mentioned, rigidity, nonconformity. We're looking for any antisocial attitudes that are demonstrated in that testing. And do they match or not match what we've discovered in the psychological interview? We look at an applicant's level of volatility. So that is, do they have a quick temper? And has that temper played out in any violent outbursts? And then we look at social difficulties. That scale is actually quite important in understanding how individuals are able to relate to others. And we know that plays a large role in developing empathy for people that are not similar to us. So after that interview is done, I then will follow up and contact anyone at other stages of that applicant's process where the information might be conflicting in any way. For example, if what is reported in the polygraph is not the same as what the applicant reported to me, we're looking at some integrity judgment issues. And so I will follow up and clarify to make sure I have all the appropriate information. And then I integrate all the data to make a suitability determination. So that is the summary of what we do in our corner of the process.
Thank you, ladies. Director DeLong, did you have any final remarks?
I just wanted to go over those details. I'll leave it to the next group of the people who are going to talk about the background, because I think that is a lot of intertwining with civil service. And I think that'll kind of wrap it all together once you get their parts of the conversation.
Okay, perfect. And that leads me to our next the guest speaker.
Question?
Up next. Oh, yes. Councilmember Tyson.
Yes, I would just like to find out, does their psychological testing include any bias descriptors?
Over the two instruments that we give, there are multiple scales that give us information on all sorts of emotional health. When we're looking at bias, we don't have a scale that says bias in any of our psychological instruments necessarily, but instead it's an interpretation of multiple scales and patterns among those scales. So if we see someone that is high on nonconformity, indicating that they have some antisocial tendencies, they're manipulative and very self-serving, they are very rigid in their thinking, they're high on the volatility scale, which isn't what necessarily what they're reporting to me during the interview, but it's what the testing is picking up on. And they do have some difficulties. That's the profile of somebody that is not going to be very flexible or open-minded in their thinking. And that then lends itself towards us looking deeper to have a conversation with them about any biases. So it's really more an interpretation of the psychological data and the combination of the scales, combined with what we have from their background investigation and their polygraph. Is that more clear?
Councilmember Tyson.
Thank you.
Well, while we still have your attention, ladies, we were going to go through all of our speakers, but it seems like a good time to just allow the council members to ask you any direct questions, why those questions might be on their minds and spirits. So, Pro Tem Brown, do you have any questions for Director DeLong or our speakers?
Yeah, thank you. This is directed towards our speakers. Thank you, Councilmember. This is actually a follow-up on Councilmember Tyson's question. It makes sense to me that someone would not self-report bias, and so that you are sort of looking at other psychological instruments. But I'm also aware that not just volatile people are racist. And oftentimes it's seemingly level-headed people holding racist ideologies who can create some of the most insidious outcomes. So I am wondering if there are, in this field of psychological screenings, emergent tests or additional instruments that could more precisely go after understanding bias, period, but racial bias in particular. Again, not going to be self-reported. I understand that, but would be curious if there are other methods that you're immediately aware of.
Sure. So one of the things that our psychological instruments do is they have validity scales and reliability scales. And so if somebody is attempting to look good, or on the other end of the spectrum, fake bad, it will flag it for us. And often, I would say often, occasionally, I'll have an applicant come in who is attempting to appear perfect. And that actually flags the validity scales and lets me know that that psychological testing is not valid, is not an accurate representation. Now, applicants don't realize that they might be answering too far in one direction. This is a validity that it's very difficult to trick. That's why we standardize these assessments on a wide variety of people. And there's a kind of validity called face validity, where you can you see very clearly what the question is asking and answer it in the direction of the way that you want to appear. but these instruments have a deeper layer of validity beyond face validity that allows them to not understand exactly what we're asking and how we're asking it. And so you don't need to be flagged on the volatility scale to be seen as biased. The nonconformity scale and the rigidity in thinking is very important. And so we're looking at a rigidity to flexibility, okay? And we're looking at a conforming to non-conforming and how severe or extreme they are on each of those scales. There are some instruments that are being released this fall that there is no clear bias abilities necessarily, but the norming data is more exciting for us in the psychological world in terms of who they're normed on and what those instruments are looking at. The instruments that we do give are for abnormal and normal behavior, but they're also looking at abilities that are specific to a law enforcement career. They're looking at attributes that we know we would like to see in a healthy, resilient, flexible officer. There was something else I wanted to mention. And in general, when we're looking at an applicant, we're looking to make sure that applicant does not fall outside the parameters of tolerable risk. One of the things in our field of psychology, one of the most difficult things for us is to predict aggressive or violent behavior. So we deal with this both in a clinical capacity as well as in a pre-employment psychological evaluation, for example, for these law enforcement officers. And so, I lost my train of thought. Sorry, somebody walked by and I completely lost my train of thought.
Okay.
I was talking about the validity.
The
Yeah.
volatility and in a clinical and non-clinical
Yes.
capacity.
So the instruments that we have chosen are specific to law enforcement. I guess that was my take-home point, was because those attributes are specific to dealing or to finding officers that aren't particularly biased. The other thing to consider is that, you know, there's explicit and implicit bias. Explicit bias is obvious, similar to what Dr. Jeffries was talking about in terms of hate group affiliation. There's very overt, obvious, people say biased or racist, homophobic type statements and see it as a healthy viewpoint. You're right, they may not see themselves negatively while speaking those thoughts. But there's also implicit bias, which is a very big challenge for our career field as a whole, because all of us have implicit biases of some sort. Every single one of us, based on how we were raised, how we were educated, the things that we were taught, and we aren't necessarily aware of them. It's our responsibility to become aware of them. Now, as a psychologist, if I see that in an applicant, that is a significant red flag, because if an applicant cannot have a conversation with me about current events, about the protests downtown, and without leaking any of these biases that they may have, they certainly don't belong in that career field. We do not have a tool in the field of psychology that can pick up black and white on whether or not somebody has a bias that it would affect the career in a negative way. For example, there's the implicit association test that was released many years ago, and it is to determine if you are in favor more of white versus black. And the more testing the field did on the implicit association test, the more that they realized that they were getting very inconsistent results. So, for example, the reliability of that assessment tool was not strong. The same person could take the test and appear biased towards white. The same person could then take the test again, knowing that the test read them as biased towards white, and end up appearing biased towards black. And so that tool isn't very useful for us if we're not getting the same result every time we give it. It needs to be within a confidence interval. It needs to be within a range that we can predict the next time I give this individual this test, we're going to see that they're going to perform similarly, so that we know that we're testing what we think we're testing. Because we also don't want to lose out on a good candidate that has a diverse background, that has, maybe not the stereotypical four-year college education development, but can bring a lot of flexibility, critical thinking, quick responding to, for example, the domestic crisis situations. We know that those are the most dangerous for officers to go into, and how they de-escalate that situation plays a huge role in their safety and our safety of our citizens. And so we need to make sure that our instruments are testing what we really think they're testing. And when this implicit association test was developed, everyone was incredibly excited. We thought, this is what we need to do. We need to give this IAT to every person coming through. And then we discovered it actually doesn't provide the reliability so that we know we're testing what we want. And so we don't have a tool that's that beautiful and packaged up and perfect. Instead, we have instruments that flag characteristics that tend to be present in people that have strong negative biases towards certain groups.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Councilmember.
Councilmember Dorrance?
Thank you, Councilmember. Quick question, and I understand if you don't have an answer, but I was curious if you could speak a little bit more to that rigidity to flexibility scale that you're talking about. So Dr. Jeffries is talking about, attracting, folks to this position because it's a very difficult one to deal with on an everyday basis. So there needs to be a, certain decision-making process for these folks to deal with very stressful and important situations that are found in front of them. And I guess it strikes me, so when you talk about the rigidity to flexibility, it strikes me as very interesting to talk about, because I would imagine we're looking for a certain amount of rigidity within a flexible kind of nature, because we want folks to be able to respond appropriately to what's in front of them, but we're also placing them in a system that has a lot of procedures and policies about how, when X happens, you're supposed to do Y. And so I'm curious if you just sort of speak to how that, where are we looking sort of on that scale? Because again, when Dr. Jeffries is talking about this, it really strikes me as we're looking for folks that are can have a real flexible outlook to how they're dealing with what's in front of them. But again, as a division, we're also asking a lot of officers to say there's very specific things that have to happen when something occurs. So I was wondering if you could speak to that for a moment.
Sure. So what we're looking for are individuals that are capable of being disciplined, but have flexibility in their thinking. So discipline and flexibility are different. You can have someone who is quite disciplined in, let's say, their educational goals, their physical health goals, their nutrition, in engaging with other people without losing their temper. They're very disciplined and planned. We don't want that person to also be very rigid in how they're thinking about the world. Okay, because there are all of the time situations that officers don't expect to be thrown into. We'll see the recruits and they think they know what they're to expect when they go out into the real world. And 6 months in, they'll say, wow, I thought I knew what this career was. And it's not quite what I imagined. And so they need to have the flexibility and thinking to apply their skills in sometimes a creative yet still very lawful and according to the book manner. But we need them to be disciplined. And if there were someone that is not disciplined that made it into the academy, we would see them struggle pretty significantly if they do not respond well to the discipline that is part of that training program. I'm trying to think of another example off the cuff that I could come up with, but does that help you understand the difference between the discipline and the cognitive flexibility?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Councilmember Dorrance. Councilmember Remy?
That yeah, I just was curious if behavioral health is a big aspect of the position, and I kind of wanted to hear you expound a little bit about the type of questioning that goes along with the behavioral health, and if we need to be looking at better training as a result towards doing the actual job itself as it relates to behavioral health.
Are you asking what we're discussing in the applicant's personal behavioral health?
Yes, and then their ability to is there any evaluation in their ability to, you know, be kind of a behavioral health expert in the field?
So the officers do get CIT training, critical incident training, when they complete the academy and their probationary period. They come back and do that. We do not do that, but they do get behavioral health training in that CIT format. When they're in the academy, they also get education about behavioral health, and we do teach that portion of the academy, and helping them to understand what behaviors and symptoms citizens may show that would indicate that they're under significant psychological distress, and that their behavior is not motivated necessarily by any sense of aggression. So they do get education about that during the academy portion. During the psychological screening process, we're looking specifically at that applicant's behavioral health, not necessarily whether or not they have a strong background ahead of time in mental health, behavioral health, and illness, because they do have the opportunity to learn that once they are a recruit. So we look into any history of depression or self-injury. We know that individuals that self-injure really struggle with emotional regulation, and they respond poorly when they have extreme feelings on either end. We look into any history of panic disorder, generalized anxiety, more severe mental illness such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. We do have applicants at times that may have been prescribed an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication in the past. If that's the case, we look into whether or not it's effective, what dosage they're on currently, how long their symptoms occurred, how long have they been in remission of those symptoms, and what kind of treatment did they seek out. We look extensively, I look into their trauma history, both their developmental trauma, as well as any military combat related trauma, assault-based trauma in their early adulthood, or in any of their romantic relationships, because we do know that trauma can change the brain. We need to ensure that they have received adequate treatment before they would experience a situation that can be as demanding as the academy and a career in law enforcement. It would be irresponsible of us to send somebody on through the process that had significant trauma symptoms, because it would be harmful to them as well as to the public, that they need to be clear-minded and emotionally stable in order to serve well. Other areas that we're looking into are ADHD, if that's been medicated, how severe is it? We do have applicants who may have been diagnosed with ADHD in their early childhood. There's a percentage of individuals with ADHD that are able to have decreased symptoms as they mature and as the brain matures, and into adulthood they're not medicated. But if there is a previous diagnosis of ADHD, we really look even deeper into any pattern of impulsive behavior and how that may affect their overall judgment. And that actually does link into substance use, sexual behavior, any form of addiction. We do look and make sure that they do not have a history of significant substance abuse, that using either legal or illegal substances to self-medicate in times of stress is not a significant part of that person's past, because as Dr. Jeffries had mentioned, being a police officer is one of the most challenging, emotionally stressful careers that there is, and they are exposed to trauma as an inherent part of the career. They're first on scene to pretty horrific car accidents, to suicides, overdoses, to significant child abuse. And so we need to make sure that they have the emotional stability, that they are most likely to be resilient in the future.
One quick follow-up. Are there any tests out there to measure empathy?
There are. We do have a scale within our tests that we give that does look at empathy. We don't often give instruments specifically to target one attribute. Instead, there are questions embedded throughout these hundreds of questions for each assessment that do touch on levels of empathy.
And is any of those markers looked at, by the Columbus Police Department, as far as that one in particular?
So what we communicate to the Columbus Police Department is whether or not an applicant is fit to move on for the career. So we interpret the data as the psychologist, and then if there are major areas of concern, those areas of concern along with the rating are passed on to the police department.
So there's no specific diving into, like, if you have somebody that really shows that they're non-empathetic, for instance, we're not pulling those. You're not necessarily saying that this is a problem, nor are we pulling those candidates from the pool.
No, that is a huge problem if they don't have empathy. There's typically something pretty pathologically wrong with somebody if they do not demonstrate any empathy at all. Those individuals are antisocial in nature. By antisocial, we don't mean does not communicate with others. We mean specifically does not have empathy or the ability to take somebody else's position or perspective in life. And that's actually a really dangerous profile to have somebody in a law enforcement position, because they have a significant amount of power and the ability to use that power for unhealthy means. So that nonconformity scale, as well as an empathy scale, are what we are looking at when determining if somebody can relate to others' feelings and cares about their position. So an individual that has extremely low levels of empathy would not be cleared to move on. We would not recommend them to enter the academy. So the thing about the psychological testing instruments is that they require psychological interpretation. So it's not the process where we pass along a bar graph to the department and then they make a decision. We interpret that psychological data as psychologists, and then we pass along a level of recommendation.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
And Council President Hardin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Many of my questions have been answered. I guess the one question that I would ask to our guest would be, based off of your experience and the work that you've done, as you've used some of these, it kind of almost seems limited to. You have to be really a really unique and balanced way to pull out these biases, especially along race, biases in general. Have you ever pulled a candidate, and how often have you pulled a candidate for not meeting that, even your threshold?
Yes. So I would say the most common reason for a candidate to get pulled would be poor judgment. That poor judgment is demonstrated. I will get to the race question, but to answer the most common reasons the applicants are pulled are for behaviors such as driving while intoxicated and the recency of that. And if somebody has had a DUI 15 years ago, we evaluate that and consider that differently if their behavior has changed than if it's been 18 months ago. That is a serious concern for judgment, let alone the substance abuse portion. Sexual behavior and addiction, and significant mental health concerns like self-injury without treatment, especially the recency of that. We have pulled applicants for racism that has been expressed either in a direct comment in an interview, and it's interesting because when those comments do come out, the applicants often show very little insight into why that would be damaging or negative. So those that do let those comments slip in the midst of the depth of our conversation, because they get quite comfortable over the course of an hour to an hour and a half, people really do come out of the shell when those comments are released. That absolutely is a factor that would not get them passed on.
Thank you. So, and you have pulled somebody because of that kind of
yes, sir.
instance.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So my question goes to one of diversity. Is there diversity in those who are actually conducting the screening and in the creation of the tests that we are talking about tonight, of the candidates that they're subjected to?
So are you asking the normed data that the assessment instruments are?
Yeah, and the reasoning behind that is, it's admittedly, if we're just speaking about race in this context, there have been lots of studies conducted with how psychology is applied or not applied to persons of color. And so, just as we're talking in this context, if we have only white people creating these tests, and you don't have diversity in those in that creation, are we effectively weeding out what we are trying to weed out if there's not a voice present that says this is an actual problem, right?
Yes. So I see it less of a concern as to who's creating the test and more of a concern as to who's taking the test, because what we need to make sure is that certain minority groups are not spiking unnecessarily as a group on certain scales that would keep them out. So the concern there is that they would be weeded out unnecessarily because they're something about them, be it their gender or their race or their socioeconomic system, would cause them to score higher. And our tests, high is bad. We're not talking about a 90% A. We're talking about a scale being a concern, a significant concern. And there are instruments that we have picked up on, and we stopped using them for those reasons. One in particular, it was Black men were scoring high on a scale of cynicism and some antisocial thoughts. And we stopped using that instrument because that was a significant concern. Now, that instrument has been recreated and renormed and is coming out this fall, so we may reconsider using that. But there were some research studies that came out in the past 6 years that were both showing a problem and then not able to recreate that problem. So because of the discrepancy, we stopped using those tools. The instruments that we do use are normed on law enforcement, which means that there are more white men in that sample, but every few years they are renormed, and so those scales should be coming out. The assessment instruments that we use are definitely used across the country by police and public safety psychologists in all 50 states, and it's certainly the best that we have now, but we're definitely looking to make sure that the sample that the tests are normed on is going to more accurately reflect the population. Now, the population does change city to city. For example, the African American population in Columbus is going to be different than Atlanta, Georgia, or than in LA, but we're looking at nationwide percentages and that the instrument's normed across the country.
Okay.
Does that help, Councilmember Favor?
It kind of does. It's really hard for me to reconcile your point that it doesn't really matter who's a part of the creation of the test. It's more about the applicant pool. But we can definitely just conversate a little bit more offline, excuse me.
Well, I definitely wouldn't say doesn't matter, but the focus is to make sure that the test takers are representing, I should say that the norm sample represents the applicants coming through.
Okay.
So as an African American female, you are accurately represented in that normed sample so that if your scores come out good or bad, it's an accurate representation of you as an individual, not another aspect of you being female. Does that help?
It does. It does. I just want to make sure that we are getting to the heart of what we're talking about today. And if the questions that we're asking, if the tools or the tests that we're using are actually able to weed those folks out appropriately. And it's to some degree, if a person has had one solid experience, whether you're a psychologist or not, you do not have the experience of a gay Black man. You don't have the experience of a minority pursuing office, a police officer role, correct? So
Correct.
if you don't have that input as those questions are being developed, how can we accurately weed them out, whether or not I'm accurately represented in the questionnaire? I hope I'm asking that accurately.
You are, and I also want to help give you a full picture. Is that in order to ethically, psychologically assess an applicant, we cannot weed them out solely based on the testing data.
Gotcha.
So we do have an applicant that comes through and they're flagged on certain scales, such as the cynicism scale, the nonconformity scale. Then we integrate that with the psychological interview and how did they respond as we question them further based on the data indicating there's a concern in this area. And so I can speak personally. I've never failed someone solely based on psychological testing data. It is always integrated with the interview.
Gotcha.
And a more thorough inclusion of that individual's personal history.
Okay.
That should help too.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.
Next, we're going to, thank you, ladies. We truly appreciate you all. Next, we're going to move on to Deputy Director of Public Safety, Craig Stone. Director Stone, the floor is yours. Director Stone, you're still on mute.
Thank you, Councilmember Favor, President Harder, council members, guests, and residents. The Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission made 80 recommendations to Mayor Ginther. Also, there was a subcommittee formed on 21st century policing, and recommendations were made in 14 different areas, including improved hiring, diversity, and inclusion. President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, first pillar is based on building trust and legitimacy. It states that law enforcement should strive to create a workforce that encompasses a broad range of diversity, including race, gender, language, life experience, and also cultural background to improve understanding and effectiveness dealing with all communities. The goal is to hire applicants who have had positive interactions with people of various cultures and backgrounds. Procedurally just behavior is based on 4 central principles: treating people with dignity and respect, giving individuals voice during encounters, being neutral and transparent in decision-making, and conveying trustworthy motives. Research demonstrates that these principles lead to relationships in which the community trust officers are honest, unbiased, benevolent, and lawful. And getting to the point, hate group affiliation is addressed in the Columbus Police hiring and screening process. However, Mr. Austin Owen makes a valid point. We could strengthen this area. We can make it stronger by including the words hate group affiliation on the personal history statement and including it as a background removal standard. At this point, I would like to introduce Richard Blunt, the Public Safety Manager in the Background Investigations Section for the Columbus Division of Police. He will explain the background process as it pertains to hate group affiliation, and he will also respond to any questions from council. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Stone. Good evening, everyone. I do have some slides to share here. See that? Everyone see the slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. In the interest and out of respect of the allotted time, I'm not going to talk about the entire background investigation process, but instead focus on the subject of this evening, which is hate group affiliation, and the questions that we currently ask in the Constitutional Police background investigation unit. So, as Director DeLong mentioned, the background investigation process begins after that 3-phase testing process by civil service. Talked about the first phase of the background investigation is the personal history statement, or PHS. Each applicant is sent a lengthy questionnaire, and part of that questionnaire, there are a few questions regarding hate group affiliation. In the undetected acts portion of that, there is a question that asks, at any time in your life, have you ever committed a hate crime? It's just a simple yes or no response to that. Then later on in the personal history statement, candidates are asked, are you now or have you ever been a member or associate of a criminal enterprise, street gang, or any group that advocates violence against individuals because of their race, religion, political affiliation, ethnic origin, nationality, gender, sexual preference, or disability? Immediately following that question, it asks, has any member of your family ever been a member of or associated with any street gang or organized criminal enterprise, such as outlaw motorcycle groups, prison gangs, or tagging crews? I recall Dr. Jeffrey speaking about how when we screen for a jury duty, they're asked if any family member is in any way associated with the case. So we do ask not only about the candidate, we ask about family members. And then lastly, on the personal history statement, we ask, do you have or have you ever had a tattoo signifying membership in or affiliation with criminal enterprise, street gang, any group that advocates violence against individuals because of their race, religion, political affiliation, ethnic origin, nationality, or gender? So those are the questions that are currently asked on our personal history statement or questionnaire. Again, that's the first thing that they get when they make it to the background investigation phase of this hiring process. Next, we do have, I believe, Councilmember Remy talked about our tattoo policy. We do have a tattoo policy, and these are a few excerpts from that. You are not allowed to have any tattoos on your head, neck, or hands that are visible. With the exception, there's some exceptions, like people get the wedding bands tattooed on their fingers now, and eyebrows and such. Those would have to go to the uniform committee to be approved. But any other tattoo that is visible in your hands, neck, or hands, correction, head, neck, or hands, is prohibited, and they have to be removed. But most importantly, of our tattoo policy, we say that the division directors say you shall not have any tattoos, visible or not visible, that depict obscene, gang-related, extremist, or otherwise offensive images, which may bring the division into disrepute. And then we talk about, we let the candidates know that when they come in for their polygraph appointment, these visible or exposed tattoos will be photographed. Of course, we do have a polygraph examination. So this is another part of our background investigation process in which the candidate is asked questions about hate group affiliation. So the candidate, when they come in for this appointment, they're first taken to the ID unit where they will be fingerprinted and photographed, and if they have any visible tattoos or exposed tattoos, those will be photographed as well and kept in the database. Then they're brought up to the background investigation unit to meet with their background investigator. During that pre-interview, the background investigator goes over that entire personal history statement one more time with the candidate to see if something else came to mind that they didn't think of originally, to make sure all the information is accurate. Maybe they moved, had to change the address, so whatever it may be. So just to make sure everything's accurate to date. Because the next thing they're going to do is go into polygraph. So we want them, if they thought about something, they didn't put another drug they used or another crime that they knew about or committed, we want to get that off of their conscience and off of their mind. So they go over the entire PHS. Then they're taken over to the polygraph unit. The polygraphist has their own set of questions that they go over. It's like over 100 questions that they go over, a series of questions. The candidate is not hooked up to any polygraph devices at this time or instruments. But a part of that questioning that regards hate group affiliation is, to your knowledge, have you, your spouse, significant other, or any member of your family or close friends ever been associated with any subversive, radical, or terrorist organization? And they answer yes or no. And then the same applies to hate groups and then to gangs. Then the last question we asked in that booklet is, have you ever posted offensive, derogatory, or racist material to social media? So those are the questions that are asked during the pre-interview or questioning phase prior to being hooked up to any instrumentation on the polygraph examination. Now, after we finish asking the questions in that booklet, the candidate is hooked up to the instrumentation. However, they are not being recorded yet. They are given 4 documents. We call mind maps. Okay. The subject of each one of those are falsifying information, illegal substance use, sex offenses, and serious crimes. The mind map that discusses or deals with hate crimes affiliation or hate group affiliations is a serious crime. This is what that looks like. So what happens is we hand the candidate this document. We tell them, look at this document and everything in each one of these circles, and tell me if anything comes to mind regarding any of these crimes that we haven't already discussed. Again, this is right before the instrumentation is hooked up, but they're not being recorded yet. But right after this, the instrumentation will be turned on and the test will begin. Because we want this to be fresh in their mind. So you can see right below the center circle of serious crimes, it says hate crimes, racially motivated crimes, gang membership, and terrorist sympathizing. Right? So, and we tell them, let us know if anything comes to mind. You know, the object of this is just to get everything off the chest, off the mind, so that when we ask you the question during the test, you don't show any reaction to that. So either they'll tell us, oh yeah, I remember this or whatever, or they say, no, nothing comes to mind. Okay, so the test begins. And a lot of people think, you know, a polygraph takes about anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours, but you're only really hooked up to the instrumentation and being recorded for about 15 minutes of that. Okay, so what we ask them in regards to this is, are you now concealing any information regarding serious crimes? Okay, and if they are, and they say no, then they're going to show a reaction, physiological reaction that they can't control. Something's going to happen, heart rate's going to increase, the blood pressure's going to increase, something's going to happen. So that's when we'll show something on our charts. And that's why we want this to be fresh on the mind. So we asked that question, and we asked the same question regarding sex crimes and all the other mind maps that we discussed. At the conclusion of the test, the polygraphist will come to one of three conclusions: either deception indicated, no deception indicated, or inconclusive. And pending your questions, that concludes my portion of this presentation. These are the questions and techniques we currently use regarding hate crime affiliation. As the director said, we definitely can always, improve in your suggestions.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt and Deputy Director Stone. I'll kick it right over to my council members for questions. Pro Tem Brown, do you have any questions?
Thank you, council member. Brief question for Mr. Blunt is just whether any verification is done of the two questions regarding racist or biased social media posts and membership or familial membership in any terrorist, not terror, in any of the hate groups, all the definitions you put in the PowerPoint.
So your question is there any verification done?
Yeah, for their answer. What?
Their response?
Yeah, I was asking about verification. I know you do the lie detector test, but do you do any, searching through their social media or, finding other sort of documentation of whether there were lies?
Sure, to a certain extent. Of course, we can't ask for the username or password, but we do a general search. So if the candidate Facebook or Instagram page locked down, we definitely do a social media search to see what we can find out. So we can see.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Blunt. Thank you, Councilmember.
Councilmember Dorrance?
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Chair Favor. Mr. Blunt, just a quick question. So I know you went over in the presentation, asking somewhat specifics about folks' engagement or involvement, either themselves or close family members with certain groups. I was curious, are they provided with a list of examples, thinking about, being affiliated with and I understand that you can never have a full list. We're only asking about these things. But are they provided with, for example, but not limited to, these groups specifically?
No, Councilmember Dorrance, they're not given a list of examples. However, when they come in for that pre-interview, when I discuss the background investigator goes over each question with them, they do give them verbal examples.
Okay. Yeah, I guess
they're filling it out by themselves. They're not given physical list.
Gotcha. So just to clarify, so again, I guess in that discussion that they have, I guess when they sit down, because I guess one of my concerns is that someone may be in a position where they don't, when we're talking about sort of unconscious biases here, folks may be affiliated with a group or they have a close family member that's involved with the group that they may not view as a hate group or as a group that's been involved in violence. So I guess for those that we're aware of, specifically here in Ohio and more specifically in Central Ohio, that I think would be an improvement in our process to make folks aware of the groups that we're specifically asking. It's certainly not limited to, and again, there's no way we're going to be able to put every group on a list there, but that certainly seems like an area for improvement for us. But I appreciate the presentation. Thank you.
Welcome.
Councilmember Remy?
Thank you very much, Councilmember Favor. The verbiage, the forums, and the means of communicating by hate groups amongst themselves is obviously evolving all the time. Can you talk about how Columbus Police Department maintains an awareness of the various channels of communication so that you'll have a sense of whether or not officers are affiliating with these groups?
I cannot speak to that. So,
Mr. Blunt, I think your audio is going in and out a little bit.
okay.
That's better.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. No, I cannot speak to that. Councilmember Remy, I don't know if Director Stone.
Director Stone?
The Columbus Division of Police does have a counterterrorism unit. They do investigate domestic and international terrorism. So those officers have secret clearances, and they work closely with the Ohio Fusion Center and FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force to investigate those people, those groups.
Thank you. Councilmember Remy, does that answer your question? Perfect. Council President Harden?
I apologize. I don't have any questions.
Thank you. So my question really is around the questions that are asked specifically around hate, and they appear to be very narrow in the sense that they're asking specifically if the individual has created crimes as it relates to hate, or someone that they are affiliated with, or a family member has committed some type of a crime. But as we've learned this evening, the reality of implicit bias and covert affiliation is really hard to truly capture. And so does the test that we currently employ, our background check process, is it actually capturing it? I have to admittedly say I'm really shocked to learn that the polygraph portion, the portion in which the officer is actually hooked up to the device, is only 15 minutes. And so if we know that it's hard to figure out whether there's a covert affiliation, can we go further in this process to weed out folks on the front end?
I definitely, as I opened this presentation up with Madam Chair, I definitely think there's room for improvement. We can ask some more specific questions, some more pointed questions about hate group affiliation. Because as someone said, I mean, you may not consider yourself affiliated with a certain group,
Absolutely.
but you still can have those feelings, right?
Yeah.
So I definitely think there's work to do. With regards to the polygraph, the reason why it's only 15 minutes that you're actually, and that's a ballpark number, of course, but you're asked all of these questions, so you will show some type of reaction, because if you haven't admitted that, if you have something that you came in the door with that you're withholding, it doesn't take that long to detect that. Because again, you can't control those responses.
Yeah.
But I understand, that the shock and surprise from that. But, I also, you also don't want to have it hooked up the entire time, and they get fatigued and inaccurate get inaccurate reactions on the chart that you may think are deception.
Yeah.
Shorter test is a better test in terms of.
Okay. Director Stone, any closing remarks from you? Thank you, Mr. Blunt.
You're welcome.
You're on mute.
Thank you. I believe we have measures in place that will detect individuals that we would not want to hire, but there are places for improvement that we can work on. This hearing is very very fruitful, and they hear this discussion, and we always want to look for ways to improve.
Councilmember Favor may be having a technical difficulty at the moment. We'll give it 1 second to see if we can get her back. All right, Councilmember Favor's having a bit of a technical difficulty. I believe maybe the final presenter, and I'm waiting to hear from her team via text, is our esteemed director of HR, and she's back. See, I was giving you an assist.
I apologize for the technical difficulties, everyone, but it seems like I'm right on time. Director Brandon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, Councilwoman Favor, President Harden, members of council, and guests. Thank you for the opportunity to present and discuss the disciplinary process here within the City of Columbus. Employees are provided central work rules, division directives, other policies, including anti-discrimination policy, equal employment opportunity policy, the electronic communication policy, etc. They are provided these at the time of hire, and they're redistributed during their tenure. Employees are on notice of the behavior and conduct that is expected of them and the behavior that is considered not acceptable in the workplace. Employees are expected to perform in a mature and responsible manner at all times. And if and when employees, if we determine that their behavior falls outside of this, there are disciplinary procedures that are generally outlined in the collective bargaining agreements, in management compensation plan, and in our Civil Service Commission rules. Pursuant to the Civil Service rules and any applicable collective bargaining agreement provisions, any employee who violates any of these rules may be subject to disciplinary action, including reprimand, suspension, demotion, or termination from city employment, and this depends on the seriousness of the rule violation, the employee's disciplinary history, and any other relevant factors. The city will follow a policy of progressive disciplinary action by imposing increasingly severe disciplinary action on those employees who repeatedly violate these rules. The city does reserve the right to forego progressive disciplinary action and impose more severe disciplinary action up to and including termination to fit the severity of the rule infraction. And lastly, as part of the process, employees will have an opportunity, if they so choose, in conjunction with their bargaining units, to grieve the decision that's been made, and that's when we would hear either a grievance hearing, or it may go to arbitration or to court. If an employee's behavior, and as we'll discuss further, I'm sure, there's no specific terminology in some of these policies that say hate group affiliation. However, if their affiliation with any group results in behaviors that is inconsistent with what is expected of a City of Columbus employee, then the disciplinary process would begin and charges would be drawn up. So I am open to any questions and discussion that you all may have.
Thank you, Director Brandon. Pro Tem Elizabeth Brown, do you have any questions for Director Brandon?
I do not, Director. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I do not, Director. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Councilmember Dorrance.
Director, just for clarity purposes, you said charges. We have a lot of folks that are watching us tonight. I wonder if you could just clarify what you mean by charges. So if someone was to be disciplined, just so there's no confusion about that being a criminal proceeding. So if you could just speak to that for a moment. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I apologize for causing any confusion here. When we're talking about charges, I am talking about administrative charges. So if there's a violation of a central work rule, a division directive, or one of the policies that we have, then administrative charges are written up. If the behavior does, warrant criminal charges, then the administrative investigation and any charges on an administrative level are put on hold until the criminal proceedings are completed. So when I am talking about charges, I am talking specifically about administrative charges.
Thanks, Director, for the clarification.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Remy?
Yeah, Director, thank you for the presentation. Appreciate it. Do we have any kind of history of our officers knowingly engaging with hate groups?
I would say from our office, we do not have any history of it. One of the reasons I can say that is because the disciplinary process for police officers is handled in the Department of Public Safety. So I would really feel more comfortable turning that over to Deputy Director Stone, because their office, as opposed to the Labor Relations section in mine, handles the discipline of police officers, and they may be able to speak to whether or not there's been any discipline imposed due to hate group affiliation.
You're on mute, Director Stone.
I'm not aware of anyone being disciplined for that reason in the Columbus Division of Police.
Thank you. Council President Harden?
Madam Chair, I don't believe I have a question for, I do not have a question for Director Brandon.
Thank you. Director Brandon, please excuse me if I'm asking a question that you've already repeated, but my internet's trying to catch up the entire time. And so any changes that the council is proposing moving forward, they would have to be negotiated in the contractual process, correct? The FOP contractual process, this go around, correct?
It would depend on what changes you are proposing. So if there are changes to the contract itself, absolutely, yes, we would need to address that either through negotiations or in a separate process that would result in an MOU or a memorandum of understanding. So it would depend on what the change is. Obviously, if it's a change that either affects the language in the contract or affects the terms and condition of the employment in some way, or would be considered what is called effects bargaining, would be necessary if, while it's not in black and white in the contract, the actual change would impact their terms and conditions. We would need to bargain the effect of the change on the members. So again, without knowing specifically what you would be proposing, I can't say that it would require negotiations in its totality, but the effects of it may.
And to your knowledge, are you aware of anything that's on the books that prohibits hate group affiliation for any employee of the city of Columbus?
Right now, the policies that we have speak to, obviously, prohibiting discrimination, prohibiting the use of racial slurs, prohibiting behaviors that I would say are short of identifying affiliation with a hate group. Again, I believe that the central work rules, the anti-harassment policy, even the electronic communications policies speak to behaviors more so than affiliation itself. And so if that's something that the council desires to see placed in these policies, that is absolutely something that our office can work towards doing. Right now, I would say the policies are worded in such a way that it focuses on behaviors.
Thank you, Director Brandon. I truly appreciate your insight tonight.
You're welcome.
Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Chief Counsel from City Attorney's Office, oh my gosh, Laura Baker-Borsch. I just combined your first and last name in an odd way. It's
Favor. At least you pronounced my first name correctly, so I'm going to forgive you for anything else. Thank you for having me here this evening. This has been a really informative session. We've learned a lot, I think, about how the city processes applicants and how individuals are disciplined for hate group affiliation or not for hate group affiliation. I'm here to talk a little bit about the First Amendment background to all of this. The First Amendment does provide certain barriers to a city, but the good news is that those barriers are a little bit less when you're talking about city employment than they would be just for individuals who are citizens where the government is acting. So if you have, when you're talking about hate group affiliation, there are two really aspects of that are that come together. And in the First Amendment, it's both your right to free speech, but also your right to freedom of association. And they're kind of married when you're talking about hate group affiliation. It's not just the fact that you're associated with that group of individuals, but oftentimes what gets an employee in trouble is that they've spoken in a manner that suggests that they're affiliated with a particular group or a particular group of thoughts. And so you have a combination of both freedom of speech concerns as well as affiliation concerns. So when you're talking about freedom of speech, public employees and those who are in the application process to become a public employee do have a lesser degree of freedom of speech from governmental interference than would as a general citizen, but it is not to the point where the government can completely curtail their First Amendment rights. First, in order to have a First Amendment right that outweighs the governmental interest, and that it is going to be a weighing kind of test, you first have to determine what kind of speech has been used. If they're speaking on a matter of public concern, for instance, if an employee is speaking about the election, the employee is speaking about something that is not just internal, interpersonal communications, but they're speaking on a matter of public concern, then the employers have to look at that in its context and determine that it is in fact something that is not just personal. Second, if they're speaking as a private citizen and not in exercising their official duties. So in other words, again, when is the employee right to free speech outweighing the employer right to curtail that speech? It's when they're speaking on a matter of public concern, they're speaking as a private citizen rather than speaking in their official capacity or in exercising their official duties. And that speech interest must not outweigh the interests of the state or the city as an employer in promoting the efficiency of the public service it performs. That's a lot of words. What that really means is that whatever is being said, even if it is a matter of public concern, even if it is being done as a private citizen, it can't undermine the overall mission of the employer. It can't create disharmony among coworkers. It can't impair the discipline by superiors. And when you're talking about hate group affiliations or comments that people make that might align themselves with a hate group as opposed to being aligned with the government as an employer, it's really you're thinking about whether or not that speech interferes with the employer's ability to perform its mission to complete its task. So if you have a police officer that is expressing very racist views, it's not just inherently evil to hear, but it might also undermine the ability of that particular department or that particular government to do the job that it needs to do. There's also a great deal of case law that would support that because the government is also acting as an employer here, they have an interest and they must have wide discretion and control over the management of their personnel and internal affairs, and that they have to be able to address unsatisfactory employees that can adversely affect discipline and morale in the workplace. Again, what you're looking at specifically here when you're talking about freedom of speech and whether or not the governmental interest is outweighed or not outweighed by the individual's First Amendment rights is whether or not it ultimately impairs the ability of the government office to do their job. When you're talking about hate groups, you're talking about a little bit different thing because now you're not just talking about the ability to do the work, but you're also talking about the effectiveness with which that work is done. So you're talking about the ability of the government to express a particular opinion and have their employees be associated with them in a way that's favorable and favors the reputation of the government. So some of the concerns when you're talking about hate group affiliation is you might have an individual employee that is affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan. How does that speak as it reflects as that individual as an employee of the city of Columbus? So when you're talking about affiliation, you're more in that bucket than you are in the actual speech. When you're looking at that, you're also going to have to try and connect that individual's affiliation with not just the fact that they're employed, but what their employment requires them to do. So the more that you have an individual who is a policymaker, the more that you have an individual who has the ability to exercise a great deal of discretion on behalf of the employer, on behalf of the city, those individuals' affiliations are going to be able to be adjudged a bit more strongly than individuals who perform a task that maybe doesn't have that same level of discretion, doesn't have that same level of impact of representing the name of the city when they do their work. So a lot of this case law here is really exciting, comes out of whether or not, if you have changed parties, when you have an elected official and they change parties, can they remove some individuals because they're not personally loyal to them? And the answer is yes. But that line of cases then also got trickled down into, okay, what if you have people that work for you that just don't follow what you want the city to be doing? And so if you have individuals that because of their affiliations, they have almost a divided loyalty, and that those affiliations and their fact that they are affiliated with those groups interfere with the ability of the governmental unit to, perform the tasks that they want to perform in the way that they want to perform them. And when you're talking about, in particular, law enforcement, the case law that's out there also gives a great deal of deference to the city when you're talking about a group affiliation, particularly for members of law enforcement, because they recognize that those individuals, for two different reasons. One, of course, all law enforcement officers exercise a great deal of discretion out on the street. They interact with the citizens in a way that most other employees of the city do not. They're making decisions regarding the ability to deprive somebody of their liberty, the use of force. Clearly, the government has a great interest in assuring that those individuals in particular reflect the views of the government in performing their tasks and are not, treating individuals with disrespect because of their affiliation with a hate group. The second thing you want to think about when you're talking about law enforcement as compared to other governmental entities or governmental departments is that they also have a chain of command type structure. So the morale within that department is very important. The requirement that individuals listen to their superiors and follow direction and follow chain of command is extremely important in that particular department. So again, if you have individuals who would not follow somebody above them as superior because of their race or because of their gender, because of their own personal beliefs as reflected in their hate group affiliation, then you might have an interest that the governmental interest might outweigh their ability or their interest in affiliating with particular groups. The concerns that you have when you're talking about writing legislation along these lines has to do with concerns about prior restraint. So when you're trying to prohibit individuals from ever speaking things that are inappropriate or speaking in a way that suggests that they're affiliated with a hate group, that's more difficult than it would be to prohibit individuals from becoming a member of the police department because they have an affiliation with a particular hate group. The reason that it's difficult is because these very much are judged in a case-by-case basis. How what you say is or is not a First Amendment protected right, and whether or not it outweighs the government's right is very much dependent upon how it was said and in what context it was said. And so because they are very specific to context, and because the First Amendment right is such is viewed with strict scrutiny, even when you're talking about weighing it against the governmental interest, it's very much more difficult to have a piece of legislation survive a challenge when you're talking about prior restraint on actual speech. But when you're talking about the ability of the government as an employer to prohibit individuals from having hate group affiliation, you have a little bit more leeway there. There, the concern becomes whether or not you're affirmatively defining that in a way that is not ambiguous. What is a hate group? Who are hate groups? What's an affiliation? What does it mean to be affiliated? Is it enough that you attended, a barbecue once 10 years ago when you were a child, and now you're applying for a job as a police officer? Would that be different from a police officer who's 23 years old and attended such an affiliation last week? So those are the kinds of things we have to be careful about in constructing language that would allow the city to get where it needs to be. I think that's less than 5 minutes.
Thank you. That was a lot of information. Councilmember Brown?
Not really a question, just making sure I heard that last point correctly, that it sounds like really any of the stickiness we could have could be taken care of through definitions on the front end. That if we're very clear about what we define as a hate group and what we define as participation, that we are then more protected in making that, again, past the hiring process, but post-employment, making that a rule or a fireable offense. Did I hear that right?
Whoa.
Okay.
I keep getting unmuted. It's a double-edged sword. You're correct. You're more likely to withstand a challenge if you have a piece of legislation that's very carefully and well-defined. The downside of that is that this is not a very clearly defined area when you're talking about bringing in employees. As we heard, the speaker 4 speakers ago, the doctors who do the mental health evaluations and what have you, there's a lot that goes into making a determination as to whether or not somebody is a particular kind of candidate that you want or not. So the caution is, if you put it into legislation, in order to make it tight enough to withstand First Amendment challenge, you might make it so tight that it's not flexible enough when you're doing the actual applicant interviews to get you where you need to be to assure that you have the right person for the job. So when you're talking about putting standards in for purposes of maybe in the directives or in the rules of professional conduct or in the central work rules, as Director Brandon was talking about, where you can have a little bit more flexibility in making those, in defining what you're talking about, you get that flexibility. When you start looking about it in an ordinance, then we got to be thinking about, what is an affiliation? What is a hate group? And can we define it cleanly enough?
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Dorrance?
Just a quick point of clarification, and I think I understood you correctly, but the city, for example, we could define, in whatever parameters we wanted to about what constitutes a hate group, but we could specifically articulate either within the legislation or provide an administrative sort of rulemaking procedure for establishing groups that fall within this definition, correct?
Yes, depending on how you wanted to go about using this information. So, I've heard a number of different statements here tonight. It seems like very clearly there's a concern about individuals who are screening to become police officers in the first place. So that's one group of individuals. Then you got a second question about what about individuals who are current employees. Well, that's when you're going to talk more about how that might be impacted by the collective bargaining agreement. Then you're going to talk about, I remember Dr. Jeffries at the very beginning talked about, individuals actually being punished and a morality, what's the word? Yes, thank you. Morality, yes. That could potentially be, a criminal violation. So I think it needs to be discussed in terms of how the law is going to be crafted, or is it going to be a law versus an administrative regulation, and then how would it be enforced?
But again, the administrative regulation aspect to it would provide us with the additional flexibility that when you're talking about that tension between being very well defined and almost too well defined to be flexible, we would have potentially the ability within some of these administrative avenues to be a little more flexible from what we would put in a piece of legislation.
I definitely agree. I mean, you could definitely have like a standard, for instance, that, during the course of, and I'm just speaking off the top of my head, so don't quote me on this, but, during the course of the application process, all individuals who are screening to become a police officer inquiries shall be made as to whether or not they have had an affiliation with a hate group. And then the actual implementation of that regulation would then come down to everything we've been discussing. How are those interviews conducted? How are background checks conducted? How long is the polygraph? Is there any verification of the information? All of that would go into enforcing that particular regulation, but the regulation itself could then be a little bit more broad in terms of a direction to the department as to what we want to see happen.
Great. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Remy?
Just thank you for the presentation. I defer to my other colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Council President Harden?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both to Director Brandon and to Solicitor General. Is that the title?
I'm Chief Counsel now, Council
Chief
President.
Counsel, I'm so sorry. I always get that messed up. I apologize. This is more of a clarity question because I think that I heard either you or the Director speak on it a minute ago, but just to the fine point around having our officers or maybe specifically having applicants sign a morality clause. The enforcement angle of that especially if it were for a current officer, would have to be negotiated. Is that correct?
Yes. So if you had an individual who signed, and again, it depends what's in the clause, but if you had an individual who signed such a morality clause or morality oath, and then it was determined that that individual did something that was against what they agreed that they would not do, it would likely violate the terms of the oath, but it also, if you want to then discipline them for that, that's something that would have to be bargained for, and I would definitely defer to Director Brandon on that. If, on the other hand, you found that that individual lied in the morality oath, then that's when you're talking about, well, could, like lying in your resume or lying in any other part of the application process, could that be something that would be criminal nature? In other words, not prospective behavior, but past behavior. They took a morality oath and they swore to, do X, Y, and Z, but in that oath, they also swore that they've never done X, Y, and Z, and you find out that they did. Again, it really depends upon what council and the city would like to have in that particular statement.
Okay. And I was just asking the question, not to make a point, but just, we have a lot of folks who are learning a lot about our collective bargaining practices, about administrative direction that we have to follow. And folks might be just wondering the basic question, why aren't we going after current police officers that may or may not have, certain affiliations? And right. I don't want to be so specific to say that we're only focusing on the applicants because we have the most leverage, but it's certainly right. A lower we have more opportunity there versus current officers. Is that correct?
Oh, that's definitely true, because applicants are not yet covered by the collective bargaining agreement, and they're already putting themselves out there to be screened for the purposes of determining whether or not you wish to hire them. Whereas a current employee, you can't just start an investigation against that individual without any cause to believe that they have committed an infraction. So if you have an individual that has been identified who's on the police department who has, is marching with the KKK, there are current provisions of the directives and the work rules, and there are current provisions they may already be violating. But the question is, how would you at this point in time be able to go back and look through individuals, current affiliations if there hasn't been something like that that's been brought to your attention as a complaint? And that, of course, is a difficulty, and that is something that would be prohibited likely by the bargaining agreement.
This is not a hate crime question, but more of the hate speech or social media presence. A lot of what we've heard in the last 6 weeks, folks have been, I don't know if it's proactively scouring social media of police officers or such. They have sent different screenshots to members of council. What, and maybe this has already been talked about, what is the protocol though then for a threshold for current police officers in terms of language used and standards met by police? And that question could go to anybody. I'm not sure who's best suited to answer that question.
Yeah, sorry, Council President, I could talk about the process, but in terms of the actual language, that's not something that I look at every single day. I can tell you that if an individual on the police force, if somebody in the public had a concern that their social media posts might cross a line, then that would be reported as a complaint. That would then be administratively investigated, and then that investigator would determine whether or not that posting violated, a rule, a directive, a code of professional conduct, professional standards. That's the word I'm trying to get. And part of that determination would also involve this First Amendment balancing that I discussed. So, if the complaint is they engaged in speech, then as a public employee, then they're going to go through that analysis of whether or not they're entitled to First Amendment protection. But in terms of the specific language used in the Code of Professional Conduct or Professional Standards, I would defer to almost anybody else on this call for the actual word.
Director Brandon, that might be you.
Well, I'll give it a shot. I think when we're talking about some of the policies that are out there, again, and I think that Attorney Baker Morris really did a good job, I think, explaining why we don't discipline someone just for affiliation, because I think that's more difficult than looking at behavior, whether it's due to your affiliation or not. So we do focus on behavior. We have the electronics communication policy. It talks about websites that advocate the performance of violent acts against groups due to race, gender, any other biases. That's all listed explicitly in the electronic communications policy. You know, the central work rules, again, speak specifically to the use of racial slurs and discrimination or discriminatory treatment of individuals for various reasons. Again, you know, with a focus on the behavior versus affiliation, which we would spend a lot of time, I think, like Attorney Baker Morris said, trying to determine whether or not we're violating their First Amendment rights. So we are certainly open to looking at tightening up the language in the policies. And we're open to do that throughout this process with you. But I think right now, the central work rules, the electronic communications policy, speak to specifically what's prohibited without being too restrictive, because again, we want to give ourselves some flexibility as well. So we don't want to be too rigid and not be able to exercise some flexibility when we're looking at each case, because all of them are very different.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all of my council members asked all of my questions that I had today, and admittedly, Laura sent over a lot of case law for me to read, which I've been feverishly trying to get through like a law student all day today. So I feel pretty good about her presentation. So thank you, and thank you to every single panelist that joined us this evening. It has been a very informative conversation, I hope, for my colleagues as well as for our residents. And so now we're going to move forward with the public testimony portion of the hearing. I'd like to acknowledge that we have received 29 written testimonies for tonight that will be shared with all members in their offices and entered into the record. We have 8 oral testimonies this evening. Please remember, as your name is called, that you have 3 minutes. At the conclusion of those 3 minutes, there will be a respectable ding to let you know that your time has been completed. The first individual up is Mr. Chris Tavenor, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. Do we have Mr. Tavenor present?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, and you pronounced my name correctly. So, yeah, a lot of people don't get it right. Thank you, Columbus City Council, for taking time over the past few weeks and into the future to reimagine public safety. I'm Chris Tavenor, an attorney here in Columbus. I've lived in this city since 2011. I am white. I grew up in the suburbs. I speak my words not as someone who has experienced depression, but rather as someone painfully aware of the privilege I experience every day. I hope my words support the efforts of the movement for Black Lives here in Columbus. Tonight's hearing discusses including racist hate groups in any background check when hiring police officers. I think the obvious answer is yes, we should include hate groups in background checks. But I want to push the conversation beyond just background checks upon hiring. Will background checks remove the racism already present in police culture? How do we eliminate the covert racists? Is it possible to subvert a police culture that has existed for generations? I've witnessed firsthand the brutality and racism of the Columbus Police Department over the past month. They've laughed as they tow the cars of Black people. I've witnessed more than just a few cops post on social media about how they'd be completely okay with Black people being run over downtown. When I was in law school, I witnessed recordings of police officers violating the constitutional rights of young Black children. Instead of treating the child as a child, they exploited tricks to get the kid to waive his Miranda rights and coax a confession. The Columbus Police Department is infested with racism, both implicit and explicit. Any legislation Columbus City Council considers must include provisions that investigate and retroactively check the backgrounds and psychological profiles of all present and past Columbus officers. We cannot fix a problem if we do not know its roots. A culture of racism already exists within the police force, and we should be asking how we kill that problem. As an attorney, I needed to go through extensive character and fitness requirements. The Ohio Bar investigated everything about me, requiring references, both professional and personal, a record of jobs and where I lived going back to high school and more. It's an intensive, lengthy, and expensive process to become an attorney. As an attorney, I might have the legal rights of someone in my hands, but I do not have their physical life in my hands like a cop. Today, we heard about the comprehensive psychological assessments that are used currently. They go beyond how Ohio assesses attorneys, good, but clearly it's not working, otherwise we wouldn't have seen the racism of the past 45 days, or the past years and decades. So what does it look like to regularly assess all officers after they've joined the department, including periodic checks for the covert racism discussed earlier by the professor from Ohio State? I'm more worried about the historical culture of racism that exists within the department, insidiously inundating the minds of new officers. So to summarize, absolutely, we must require an investigation for hate groups and covert racism for new police officers. We must also retroactively explore the backgrounds and psychological makeups of all current officers and those who have recently left, say, in the past 10 years. City Council should support creating a more intensive statewide character and fitness process, including increasing both the initial and continuing educational requirements for future and present officers, especially implicit bias. Thank you. Black Lives Matter, and I also hope that we will consider the future call for abolition as well.
Thank you. Do any of my council members have any questions or comments for Mr. Tavener?
Madam Chair, I don't have a question. I just am still hung up on like the basic, like how would one quote unquote root out racist behavior in current policing under understanding that has to be not negotiated and that there are standards already. But just again, we have folks that are watching, and heck, some of us council members are learning also about some of the intricacies. So I'm not trying to belabor the point, but I don't even know if this is a question, but if somebody could speak to it, that the difficulty in the rooting out suspected racists. And truthfully, I believe that a lot of these instances that we hear, that I've heard about personally, I can only speak anecdotally, come from other police officers reporting racist behaviors or racist comments in particular. What is our recourse? How does that process work? And how often are we able to quote unquote, and I don't like the word root out, but I think that's truthfully what this listener is speaking, this person, a resident is speaking of, and so many others who have reached out to me.
And to add to Council President Harden's question, this is one of the initial questions that I expressed with Director DeLong and Director Brandon about retroactivity, because the reality is that people change. And, you know, when you're a fresh recruit, you know, we, in any capacity, in any career, you have one idea of that career and the world in which that career operates. And so as life happens, your opinions and thoughts may change. And so how can we carefully craft a piece of legislation that would capture that and that would touch those who have had a change of heart throughout their career?
And truthfully, the answer may be that we can't solve it all in this one piece of legislation, but I'd be interested. Again, we have all these new folks who are listening and watching and demanding things that to all of us, I believe, are common sense. We should not have open races on the police force, but the difficulty in that conversation and the administrative process in extracting that is kind of what I'm hoping that somebody could kind of just walk the public through quickly.
It's an open question.
Good evening. This is Director Brandon, and again, I did not click on because I think I have the answer. Let me just say that. But I will say that that I hear what you are trying to accomplish, and through the negotiation process, through our best practices and looking at the way our policies are drafted and worded, we will certainly do our best to try to capture current employees, but we still will be focusing on behavior. One of the things that I think you mentioned that was very important, a lot of times, especially with our police officers, the behavior is witnessed by a partner or, you know, someone else another officer. and it is very difficult to get someone to admit that something happened or wrongdoing occurred. And so that's something that we probably need to just begin to work with the department and try to get people to understand the importance of, you know, sharing what they've seen, sharing certain behaviors that we need to address, because sometimes, you know, we just don't hear about it, or their fellow officers aren't comfortable sharing something that they may believe was not, you know, good behavior, but they're not going to come out and share it with us. And so until we have a culture that embraces that type of change, it's going to be difficult. Citizen complaints are helpful. Citizen complaints come in. We were able to, you know, extend that time in the last contract, so citizens can file a complaint now up to 90 days after, as opposed to 60 days, because sometimes even citizens have concerns with coming forward and expressing some behavior of a police officer or someone in that type of authority. So it's a culture shift as well. And so again, like I said, I didn't unmute myself because I had the answer, but I do want to share that I'm open and willing to working on the language that we currently have and seeing how we can open it up a little bit to include more, and then look at things that we can do within the culture of the department and the city as a whole, to get people to share behaviors that they may have witnessed that are not what we would expect of a police officer or any other city employee.
Thank you. And truthfully, this might be a quick opportunity for me to put a plug in for my hearing that I'm hosting on Wednesday around civilian oversight in independent investigatory bodies. I think that also gets to the specifics of how we can hold folks accountable as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you, Director Brandon. Next, we have Mr. Jack Stumball.
I'm sorry, we do not have Jack Stumball.
Okay. Aaron Newman.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. You have 3 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chair Favor, members of council. My name is Aaron Newman, resident of Columbus, and I'm speaking for myself this evening. I appreciate all the useful information, very useful information from the expert presenters and city officials about our current police recruitment and hiring practices. I'm glad to hear that Columbus already has some processes to screen out applicants that may have signs of overt hate, and it's encouraging to hear discussions about how we might strengthen those processes. As noted earlier, I believe it was the city attorney's representative there, many government officials are entrusted with authority which could infringe upon a citizen's natural, moral, or constitutional rights, but police officers are unique in holding that ultimate symbol of government power, physical force, against our most fundamental rights of life and liberty. Because they will carry badges, handcuffs, tasers, and guns, applicants to the police department should rightly be subject to the most stringent recruitment requirements, including zero tolerance for extremist ideologies or sympathy toward hatred, bigotry, or authoritarianism. These are poisons that corrupt the mind, and corrupt minds lead to corrupt actions. I'm sure that most applicants to be police sign up to protect and serve their neighbors, to make their communities better, or because it's steady work with benefits and pension. They're good people looking to do good. But we all know that some small percentage of those applicants do harbor hate in their hearts. We as citizens and you as our representatives have the right and the duty to demand that they not carry the badge of the Columbus Police Department. For the good of the people of the city of Columbus, I support the strengthened screenings and other processes discussed tonight. Thank you very much for holding this hearing and for the ongoing on reforming public safety in our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Newman, for your time and for your comments. Are there any questions by any council member for Mr. Newman? All right, wonderful. Up next, we have Mr. Daniel Miles. Mr. Miles, are you?
Hello.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, I want to say thank you to the City Council for having this hearing and working to improve the situation for public safety here in Columbus. As especially the first speaker alluded to, there are definitely clear existing issues we know about within police here in Columbus. There is disproportionate violence against the Black community. We have issues within the police force of police officers of color suffering racism and facing retaliation when they try to report it. We really can't pretend that the situation currently is okay. We've had a month and a half of nonstop protests showing that plenty of Columbus residents don't think the situation is okay. And so sitting here and hearing people involved in the hiring process for CPD now saying they think it's going pretty well, and hearing Director Stone, for example, saying that maybe we can make some small changes, we'll add in a question that explicitly references hate groups, doesn't make sense to me. The expert we started this hearing with, Dr. Jeffries, explicitly made clear how we need specifically trained professionals who can ferret out these influences because it's a difficult task that is not currently being achieved by the methods we have. And I really want to urge the City Council to take that recommendation seriously, that if the expert you've brought in says that's what's necessary, that's what we have to go to. A small tweak to the existing processes won't work. An additional specific point on that note, I want to highlight Councilmember Favor's question that was very clearly not answered by Dr. Spees and her colleague about whether the people conducting these psychological interviews were from varied backgrounds. As a white person myself, I have had plenty of conversations where I have definitely known the fellow white person I was talking to was not racist, and then I learned some pieces of cultural background I didn't know about and had to change my views. Having diversity in these processes is important, and if the people conducting them now aren't aware of that, we need massive change. I want to urge the City Council not just to do the easy thing and push this for new recruits. Absolutely, please do that. But absolutely, please push for this in contract renegotiation to be able to apply these policies across the board to existing members of our police force. We can't, as much as Dr. Jeffries is optimistic about the advantages of bringing in good new people to change things, the safety of Columbus can't wait for a generational change in our police force. We need to be able to make serious changes now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miles. Any questions or comments for Mr. Miles from my colleagues? Thank you for your time, sir. Up next, we have Ms. Heather Johnson. Ms. Johnson?
We do not have Heather Johnson.
All right, wonderful. And up next, we have Ms. Anissa Awad.
Hi, all. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Well, I would like to say it's nice to talk to you all. Of course, I wish it was under different circumstances, but I want to first reiterate the just general excitement that I have of more communication between City Council and the average citizen. I think that this process, while it is a step in the right direction, we have to understand that the most vulnerable and the people that are most affected by these decisions are probably not even listening in right now due to lack of ability. They're probably working. They probably don't have internet connection. Just reiterating again consistently that the people that this is most affecting are not really at the table right now. Besides that, I do want to just generally address Dr. Jeffries' hopes for indicting and convicting people that are found of, hate crimes within or outside of the police. And I want everyone to know that People's Budget Columbus and as well as all other abolition movements don't believe in incarceration of police officers that harm other people. We believe in something called restorative justice. And we just generally think that, talking about hate group affiliation and the fact that we even have to be having this conversation just points to the general direction of Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, guys. Wow. Oh my God. Okay, just generally points to the general direction of, a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding, a lack of actual community engagement within policing departments nationwide, and especially in Columbus here, looking at our general police demographics towards our community demographics and citizen demographics, resident demographics, what have you. And just generally, we want to reiterate the fact that if we have to be discussing hate group affiliation and parsing the logistics of it and the legislation and the legality around it, we really, really need to go outside and think about what it means to build a stronger community that doesn't have to have calls like this. Again, what it means to have nonviolent criminal offenses met or calls met with violent forces, just generally. We want to have all of our council members and everyone like within the process really, really sitting down and thinking, why are we so ready to jump the gun on punishment, on picking apart, logistics of this current system that we have that we know hasn't worked, that we know is rooted in racism and patrolling of human bodies, when we can all come together and really, really address like the sole issues that we've talked about in other meetings and, one-on-one, such as housing, hunger, poverty, general poverty, education, healthcare, right? That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Right on time, right on time. Let me say that I always appreciate your hearing your voice and your advocacy. And I do have a question for you. You bring up a point that I am always very conscious of, which is ensuring that we present information and the opportunity to participate in the process in such a way that really gives the majority of our residents that opportunity to do so, with the understanding that everyone does not have time on Mondays to tune into a city council meeting online or to come down to City Hall. Do you have any suggestions for this body as we continue to navigate this tricky process?
I absolutely do. Thank you for asking, Councilmember Favor. I have been thinking about it. Obviously, I don't know the logistics that City Council has, but I mean, in these weird corona times, I know that we all are getting much more creative than we ever thought. I have definitely been thinking about, and my background is in public space and space politics. So thinking again of reorienting our communities where our priorities are. And for me, that is public space. That is things looking at, the Columbus Metropolitan Library, looking at the natural parks that we have here in Columbus, and maybe setting up screenings for them. Maybe setting up routine times to be meeting in these locations, to be talking to citizens, generally having people out there canvassing, letting people know. And again, we already do know, especially where like the most, the people that are suffering with homelessness usually reside as well, right? We can be coming to them and we should be coming to them more generally. So I think with any, besides just meeting people where they're at, just generally thinking like, where are the people that are most disenfranchised here in Columbus? Why are they there? What can we do to, meet them there? And then more generally, I think just what can we be doing in, I think breaking down the gates, right? So even in city council meetings, and I mean, obviously it's been shown that like a lot of us within city council have to be explained on these matters. And I think that even just generally that does show kind of how city council or just the general process of city governance is, very far away for a lot of us. And I think that just really being intentional in our movements and our next steps of who's here, who's not here, why are they here, how did they get here, what does it mean for them to be here?
Agreed. I truly appreciate that feedback. Are there any questions or comments from my colleagues?
I'll just quickly say, Madam Chair, that I'm a big fan of Ms. Awad's advocacy and one point that I would make is, one of the reasons why we're having this conversation and we're talking about reforming or reimagining public safety is that I don't fundamentally, I do not believe that police or police divisions are any more racist than any other institution. I think policing is a microcosm of our society. And so the true work won't be done by just focusing on police and police departments. It's going to be done by focusing on communities as well and rooting out and acknowledging racism in every form, everywhere throughout our society. And so, but for this body and for our ability to continue to protect the 900,000 souls that we have responsibility for, and the 1,900 souls that are charged and have taken an oath in protecting those souls, then I think that this is a wholly responsible place to start in having those conversations. So I would just make that point, but I appreciate Ms. Awad a lot.
Thank you, Council President Harden. Up next, we have Meryl Kaplan.
Hi,
Yes.
am I audible? Yes, I am. Okay. Thank you all. And I'm not going to take up my own time by thanking you individually, but thank you. My name is Meryl Kaplan. I'm an associate professor of folklore and Scandinavian studies at OSU. One of the things that I study is online culture and the line between joking and serious. I can tell you a little bit about a larger national context, about the online dimension of hate these days, and of the rebranding of hate as love or pride and as jokes. My research has led me to inform myself about hate groups nationally. My colleagues, my students, my neighbors, and I have seen our campus and our neighborhood flyered by hate groups, including Patriot Front, Identity Europa, the neo-Nazi NSM, and also by unknown individuals following instructions pasted on an extremist internet forum postered campus with the slogan, "It's okay to be white," which I hope to have time to get back to. This was the doors of faculty of color were targeted specifically with this phrase. The goal of people doing this has been to terrorize some and recruit others. But this is all happening in the context of a larger crisis in U.S. law enforcement. According to Professor Vita Johnson at Georgetown Law, there is an epidemic of white supremacists in police departments. And I sent as part of written testimony a whole bunch of references so you can read up on her. The Center for Investigative Reporting has found that, quote, hundreds of active duty and retired law enforcement officers from across the United States are members of Confederate, anti-Islam, misogynistic, or anti-government militia groups on Facebook. Many of these are closed groups. You can't get access to them. You can't just surf over to them. They're not hate groups tracked by the SPLC. Their content, and I've looked at some of the ones that are open, their content is full of hate speech, extremist ideology, the glorification of violence against marginalized groups and their supporters, usually framed as jokes or funny memes. And the content of them overlap with the content on Facebook groups that are dedicated to law enforcement family. So there's a problem. How did this happen? Not all of it is an accident. The FBI made an intelligence assessment back in 2006 on white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement that noted that white supremacist groups had historically been and were then engaged in strategic efforts to infiltrate law enforcement. And I've sent you some links about that. I wish I could tell you what their findings were, but that was not released. It's only been a heavily redacted version. So at a bare minimum, we should be screening CPD recruits for affiliation with known hate groups. But given that the role that Facebook groups play for sharing racist memes in organizing otherwise unaffiliated individuals around hateful ideologies, we might want to consider requiring more than that, screening social media. This is a huge challenge because hate communities are frequently virtual. They only exist in online space on Facebook or on 4chan. They aren't organizations. They aren't groups that even have. This is a huge challenge because things are floated as jokes. All live splatter is not a threat per se. But it is a problem. I echo Professor Jeffries. We need real experts on this task, people who study extremism in online spaces. There are people more expert than me. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. And I look forward to reading your written testimony as well. Any questions on behalf of my colleagues? And last but certainly not least, we have Miss Daphne Jane Okron.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Council President, members of Council, and Chair Favor for creating the opportunity for dialogue on this. Thank you for listening to the public and for having this meeting. I am not speaking on behalf of any organization. I love Columbus and I love the potential that our city has to grow and to do better for all of our neighbors. If I may quote a few verses, "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, except to be just and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." Next month, like many school teachers, counselors, staff, and administrators in the city, I will be working very hard to help our children and families cope with the tragedy, hardship, and emotions that the season has rendered, not only as a result of COVID-19, but also as a result of hatred and racism. The violence that they have seen taking place in our city and around the country against largely peaceful demonstrations has been committed to memory. The continued disregard for human life and liberty has been committed to memory. While I may not be able to hug my kiddos or hold their hands in comfort like I usually do, I knew I could speak tonight and emphatically speak for them. Regardless of socioeconomic background, all children deserve to have safe communities, quality education, and bright futures. We need to invest money back into our communities, invest in our schools and health clinics, invest in affordable mental health counseling, invest in local creative arts programs, green spaces, and food banks. Partner with nonprofits and institutions that make it their mission to support immigrant, Black, and Brown children, their parents, and communities. There are so many families who need assistance. Starting to address the needs within our city is how we can build a more justice-minded and peaceful Columbus. I am not anti-police. I want my students to be able to respect and admire police officers, not fear them. No child should have fear or terror in their heart because we've allowed individuals who mean harm to have power and weaponry without checked boundaries and consequences for excessive force or murder. No police officer committed to justice should have to worry about repercussions from within for speaking truthfully or reporting a peer who is covertly or overtly involved in a hate group. Without any accountability and change, I fear that changing perception might be challenging and division will grow. We all need to be committed to justice, love, and mercy for the sake of our children. I'm asking that the council put in place proper regulations that prioritize the safety of families and their communities. Please demilitarize the police and commit to nonviolent ways to address community needs. Take military-style weapons off the streets and institute thorough background checks. We need continual empathy and racial resentment screening specifically. Please look at social media posts and online groups for any hateful posts, intentions to intimidate, or hate group affiliation. Please have high moral expectations for those who serve and protect so that we can restore peace and trust. Hold police accountable under the law for misdeeds, as we all should be. Let's be just, let's show mercy, let's walk humbly. If we do this, I know Columbus as a whole will be living up to our potential and giving our students and families the opportunity to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Any comments on behalf of my colleagues? Well, thank you once again to all of our presenters this evening. The information you have shared has been extremely beneficial to me as well as the team here at Council that will be working to put together impactful legislation. And thank you again to all of our residents who have taken the time to once again engage in this process. I want to reiterate that by no means are we as Council stating that all police officers are inherently bad in our effort to host these public conversations about reimagining public safety. As a person of color, I have always been very careful to never make assumptions about a group of people based on the actions of a few. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the public outcry that is before us right now. Leaders should never be beyond reproach. Our job entails accountability and recalibrations as servants of the community. As a former assistant city attorney, I worked with police officers almost every day. So let me be clear, our intention to reimagine public safety is by no means an effort to demonize or to politicize a moment. I have said it before and I'll say it again, multiple things can exist and be true at the same time. I can acknowledge that there are great public servants that serve as officers, prosecutors, and judges in our community, while also acknowledging the fact that our criminal justice system is and has always been flawed. We cannot reimagine public safety alone. And as Professor Jeffries stated this evening, we must go beyond the simplistic ideas of change. Real change will not be easy and will require that all of us participate in the process. That includes officers, residents, and legislators. Hate has no place in public service. And so I am truly grateful for every single resident's time, to our presenters' time and energy, the thought and the attention that it took to bring this public hearing to fruition. I look forward to continuing to engage with our residents on another day. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.